There is a city beneath the city, not a legend, not a myth, not something a conspiracy theorist dreamed up between midnight and 3 in the morning. A literal, physical, documented, and largely unexamined city that sits below the streets you can walk on today, preserved in silence and stone, sealed away from daylight for over 2 centuries. Montreal, one of the most visited cities in Canada, one of the most photographed, most celebrated, most culturally rich destinations on the entire continent. And underneath it, hidden in plain sight, buried under 12 feet of intentional fill, there are buildings, wells, roads, foundations, and secrets that the official history of this country has never fully reckoned with. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments. Someone in Vancouver at midnight, someone in Toronto during a lunch break, someone in Quebec City who already knows part of this story and is waiting to see what I get right. We are going to spend a long time tonight in the dark beneath Old Montreal. And I want to start not with the obvious question, which is what is down there, but with the stranger, more unsettling question, which is why does almost nobody talk about it? Because that question has an answer, and the answer is more interesting than the buried streets themselves. Montreal sits on an island. That fact alone should have made it one of the most studied, most scrutinized, most obsessively documented urban sites in North America. Islands are closed systems. They have edges. They have layers. When something gets buried on an island, it does not drift away. It stays. It compresses. It waits. And on the island of Montreal, the layers go down a very long way. Through colonial French settlement, through indigenous occupations stretching back thousands of years, through geological deposits laid down before any human being ever looked at this piece of land and decided it was worth staying on. The 12 feet of deliberate street raising that happened in the 19th century is the story most people have dimly heard about, if they have heard anything at all. You raise streets by filling in the space between existing buildings with rubble, earth, gravel, and debris. The ground floor of every old building becomes a basement. The windows that once opened at street level now peer out from underground. The doorways that once welcomed visitors are bricked in, sealed, forgotten. And above them, new streets are paved, new sidewalks are laid, new hydrants and lampposts and storefronts and restaurants and souvenir shops appear, and within a generation the living city has no memory of what it replaced. But here is the thing that keeps this story from being simple. The street raising in Old Montreal was not the first time this happened. It was not even the second time. The ground beneath that island has been accumulating human stories for so long that the colonial French layer, the one that gets raised and buried by the 19th century engineers, was itself already sitting on top of something else, something older, something that the French settlers noticed, recorded in fragments, argued about among themselves, and then quietly stopped talking about. And what was underneath the French layer sits on something older still. We are going to go down through all of it tonight. Every layer, every buried room and sealed corridor, and forgotten well and hidden foundation. We are going to look at what the archaeologists found when they started digging in the 1970s and 1980s, during the construction of the Montreal Metro and during the building of the underground city that Montrealers call the Réseau. We are going to look at what the early French explorers actually wrote when they first arrived at this place, because what they wrote does not entirely match what we were taught in school. We are going to look at the indigenous history of this island, which goes back not hundreds but thousands of years, and which left marks in the landscape that the French could not explain, and mostly chose not to try. And we are going to look at the things that have been found beneath Montreal and promptly disappeared from public discussion. Objects, structures, alignments, artifacts that did not fit the story that was already being told about this place, and so were catalogued, boxed, transferred to storage, and left to wait for a future that has not arrived yet. Tonight is a long one. Get comfortable, because the city beneath the city is not a small story. There is a particular kind of silence that exists underground. Not the silence of a quiet room, which still has air movement, the hum of electronics, the distant rumble of traffic. Underground silence is different. It is a silence with weight to it. A pressure. Like the absence of sound, is itself a physical thing pressing against your ears. People who have spent time in truly deep archaeological excavations describe it the same way, every one of them, across every culture and every era of exploration. They describe it as the silence of something that has been waiting, The people who worked on the excavations beneath Old Montreal in the 1970s described it that way too. The Montreal Metro project, which began in 1966 and continued through multiple expansions into the following decades, required the most extensive urban excavation in Canadian history. When you dig a subway system under a city that is more than 350 years old, in its colonial layer alone, you are going to hit things. The engineers knew this. The city planners knew this. There were archaeologists on contract, paid to observe, document, and clear the way for the tunnels and stations and service shafts that the growing system required. What those archaeologists found was extraordinary. What happened to most of what they found is a different kind of story. Let's start with the layer everyone knows, or thinks they know. The French colonial settlement of Ville-Marie, which would eventually grow into Montreal, was established in 1642 on the southeastern tip of the island. The man usually credited with this founding is Paul de Chaumet de Maisonneuve, a pious, stubborn, militaristic French nobleman who had been sent to this particular spot on a religious mission. The colony was meant to be a beacon of Christianity in the heart of the continent, a spiritual outpost pushing into territory that France claimed on paper and needed to claim in reality. The site they chose was not random. It was not simply the first good landing spot the explorers had found after coming up the St. Lawrence River. The French chose that location because of what was already there. And this is where the official history starts to get evasive. When Jacques Cartier had arrived at this same island more than 100 years earlier, in 1535, he had not found empty forest. He had found a large, thriving, sophisticated settlement called Hochelaga. The accounts of that visit, which Cartier himself wrote, describe a community of several thousand people living in a well-planned town with long communal houses, cleared agricultural fields surrounding the settlement, and a social structure organized enough to receive a European expedition with formal ceremony. Cartier climbed the mountain at the center of the island, the one he named Mont Royal, and from its summit he looked out over a populated, cultivated landscape, fields, orchards, smoke from cooking fires rising from dozens of directions. This was not a wilderness waiting to be discovered. This was a place where people had been living, farming, building, and organizing their society for a very long time. When Maisonneuve arrived in 1642, Hochelaga was gone, not reduced, not moved, not simply less populated than it had been, gone. The massive settlement that Cartier had described in detail had vanished in the 107 years between the two visits, and nobody has ever been able to explain why in a way that fully satisfies the evidence. This is the first deep mystery of Montreal, not the buried streets of the 19th century, not the colonial cellars sealed beneath 12 feet of fill. The first deep mystery is the disappearance of a city of thousands of people from one of the most strategically important locations in the entire street, Lawrence River system, in less than a century, leaving behind nothing but traces so faint that historians spent generations arguing about whether Hochelaga had existed in the precise location where Cartier said it did. The Iroquoian-speaking people who had built Hochelaga were gone. In their place, when the French arrived, there were Algonquin-speaking peoples who wintered further up the river and came to the island seasonally. They had their own knowledge of this place, their own name for it, their own understanding of what the island had been and what it still meant. But they were not the builders of Hochelaga. They had arrived after the Iroquoians had left or been driven away or died or done whatever it was that caused an entire civilization to vacate a location they had apparently occupied for centuries. And beneath where Hochelaga stood, before the Iroquoians built it, there were older peoples still. We know this now because of what archaeologists found during the subway construction and during the later excavations associated with the underground city's expansion and during a handful of permitted archaeological digs in Old Montreal proper, where the digging conditions allowed for careful stratigraphy instead of the blasting and machine excavation that characterizes large infrastructure work. The layers tell a story that the textbooks have never been comfortable with. Below the French colonial material, which includes the recognizable detritus of 17th and 18th century European life, ceramics and pipe stems and metal fittings and glass, there is a layer of Iroquoian material that corresponds to the Hochelaga period and to the centuries before Cartier arrived. This layer has been found in multiple locations across the southeastern part of the island, confirming that the settlement was real and that it covered a significant area. Below the Iroquoian layer, things become considerably stranger, because what sits underneath the Hochelaga period material is not simply an older, less developed version of the same culture. What sits underneath it, in certain excavation contexts, is evidence of occupation going back several thousand years, with characteristics that do not fit cleanly into the established story of who was living in this part of the continent and when. We will get to the specifics of what was found, but first I want to stay with the street raising, because that is the most visually dramatic part of the story, and it is the part that creates the physical reality of what exists beneath Old Montreal today. That network of buried basements and sealed ground floors and bricked-over doorways that you can still access in certain buildings, if you know who to ask and where to look. The street raising of Old Montreal happened across a span of roughly 40 years, from the 1820s through the 1860s, with the most intensive work concentrated in the 1830s and 1840s. It was driven by a combination of factors that are mundane on the surface, but reveal something genuinely strange about the relationship between a growing city and the land it was built on. The first factor was flooding. The St. Lawrence River flooded regularly, and the lower streets of the old settlement, the ones closest to the waterfront, were prone to inundation every spring during the melt and again during any significant rainfall event in the warmer months. This was not a minor inconvenience. Flooding of the lower town destroyed property, contaminated water supplies, spread disease, and made commerce along the docks unpredictable. For a city whose entire economic identity was built on its position as a trading hub between the interior of the continent and the Atlantic world, unpredictable commerce was an existential problem. The second factor was sanitation. As Montreal grew rapidly through the early 19th century, the original street grid and drainage system, which had been designed for a much smaller colonial town, became completely inadequate. Waste accumulated, water pooled. The streets of the lower town, many of them still unpaved or paved with rounded river stones laid in no particular pattern, became repositories for everything a 19th century city produced and could not easily remove. The smell alone, by multiple contemporary accounts, was something visitors to Montreal remarked upon with consistent horror. The solution that the city engineers arrived at was simple in concept and enormous in execution. They would raise the streets. They would fill in between the existing buildings with rubble and gravel and compacted earth, until the street level was significantly higher than it had been. New drainage would be laid at the new level. New pavement would be laid on top. The buildings would be adapted, their upper floors becoming the new ground floors, new entrances created at the higher level, the old ground floors sealed off and converted to storage, or simply abandoned. What this meant in practice was that the entire character of the lower town of Montreal changed, and changed permanently, within a generation. Streets that had been at one level were now at another. The relationship between buildings and the ground around them was fundamentally altered, and everything that had existed at the original street level, every doorway, every window, every threshold stone and front step, and merchant's display ledge, was suddenly underground, sealed away, preserved in darkness while the city went on living above it. The scale of this preservation is something that is genuinely difficult to get your head around if you have not seen it. In certain parts of Old Montreal, particularly along the streets closest to the waterfront, and in the oldest blocks around the Place Royale, the original ground floor of virtually every significant building from the 17th and 18th centuries still exists, intact, below the current street level. The stones are there, the brick is there, the wooden beams, in cases where the underground environment was dry enough to prevent decay, are there. There are rooms down there that have not seen daylight in close to 200 years. There are cellars beneath the cellars, original colonial storage spaces now accessible only through narrow passages in the basements of buildings that have been renovated and re-renovated above them. Some of these spaces have been explored. A handful have been opened to the public in a limited way, as part of archaeological exhibits or heritage tours. But the vast majority have never been systematically excavated. They have been mapped, roughly, from above. Their existence has been acknowledged in heritage impact assessments and municipal planning documents. But the actual work of going into them, carefully removing the centuries of accumulated material, properly documenting what is there and what it means, has barely begun. Why? This is the question that starts to feel uncomfortable if you sit with it long enough. Montreal is not a poor city. It is not a city that lacks archaeological expertise or institutional capacity for heritage work. The province of Quebec has some of the most aggressive heritage preservation legislation in Canada, and the federal government has its own layers of protection for sites of national historic significance. There is no shortage of will, in theory, to understand what is beneath the streets of Old Montreal. But the understanding has been partial at best and actively avoidant at worst. The most charitable explanation is that full excavation of the underground layers in Old Montreal would be extraordinarily disruptive and prohibitively expensive. You cannot dig up the buried ground floor of an 18th century building without first dealing with the functioning 19th century and 20th century building that sits above it. You cannot excavate the street-level fill in a city block without temporarily closing that block to all traffic and commerce. Old Montreal is one of the most economically active tourism districts in Canada. Closing it for serious archaeology is not something the city has ever been willing to do for long enough to accomplish anything comprehensive. But the less charitable explanation, the one that starts to emerge when you look at the specific items that have been found during the limited excavations that have occurred, is that there are things beneath Old Montreal whose full significance nobody in a position of authority has been eager to examine too carefully. Let's talk about what was actually found. The archaeology of Old Montreal, such as it is, has happened in three main waves. The first wave was associated with the metro construction in the 1960s and 70s. The second wave was associated with the development of the underground city, the RESO, in the 1980s and 90s. The third wave has been a series of smaller, permit-required excavations connected to building renovations and utility work in the Heritage District, ongoing from the 1990s to the present. Each wave found things. Some of those things were expected. Many were not. During the metro construction, the most significant archaeological discoveries happened during the excavation for the station at Square Victoria, and during the tunnelling work that ran under the oldest parts of the lower town. The station excavation turned up extensive French colonial material, as expected, but it also turned up a level of site preparation beneath the colonial layer that was not expected at all. What do I mean by site preparation? I mean evidence that the ground had been deliberately modified before the French arrived, not modified by natural processes, not modified by the kind of gradual accumulation that happens when any human group occupies a space over time and leaves their garbage and their dead and their discarded tools behind. Modified deliberately, leveled in certain areas, compacted in others, with patterns in the soil matrix that suggested organized activity, the moving of large volumes of material for a purpose, in a configuration that predated the French colonial presence by more than the Iroquoian period would account for. The archaeologists on the Metro project noted this. They documented it. They moved on, because the Metro was not going to stop for archaeology. During the RESO development, which required even more extensive excavation under the central parts of the city, similar anomalies appeared. The underground city of Montreal is now an astonishing network of tunnels, shopping arcades, transit links, hotel lobbies, and pedestrian passages that runs for more than 33 kilometers beneath the city's surface. Building it required decades of tunneling through geological and historical deposits that nobody had fully mapped. The excavation teams found the usual colonial material and the usual Iroquoian material and the usual woodland period material going back 2,000 years or more. But they also found things that did not slot cleanly into those categories. There were workstones in configurations that did not match any known indigenous building tradition from this region. There were soil layers with chemical signatures indicating large-scale fire events that predated any of the documented periods of occupation, but postdated the geological baseline. There were patterned deposits of animal bone that suggested large ceremonial or feasting activity, of a scale that none of the historically known indigenous groups in this area were documented to have conducted in permanent structures. And beneath the oldest of the clearly datable material, in a few locations where the excavation went deep enough to reach what geologists call the Champlain Sea deposits, the layer of marine sediment that was laid down when this part of the continent was temporarily submerged. Following the retreat of the glaciers, there were things that had no business being there at all. I want to be careful here. I am not about to tell you that someone found ancient aliens under Montreal. That is not what this is about. What I am about to describe is something more interesting and ultimately more challenging than that, because it operates entirely within the realm of documented human behavior and documented geological time, but it requires a fundamental revision of assumptions about when and how this part of the continent was occupied. The Champlain Sea, which filled the Street, Lawrence lowlands roughly between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, as the glaciers retreated and before the land had fully rebounded from the weight of the ice, left a distinctive layer of marine clay across enormous areas of what is now southern Quebec and eastern Ontario. This clay is identifiable by any competent geologist. It is a consistent marker in the stratigraphy of the region. When you hit Champlain Sea clay, you are in material that was deposited roughly 10 to 13,000 years ago. In a handful of locations during the deep tunnel excavations associated with the Montreal Metro, workers hit this clay at the expected depth, and then, below it, in contexts that no simple explanation can account for, found traces of human activity. Not extensive traces, not a buried city under the Champlain Sea, single finds, isolated artifacts, worked flint in a context that the geological layer dated to before the sea filled this valley. Traces of ash in a context that was stratigraphically below the marine clay. Each of these finds, individually, could be explained by the natural processes of geological disturbance, frost heaving, bioturbation, all the mechanisms by which objects can move vertically through soil layers over long periods of time. And that is precisely the explanation that was applied to each of them, individually, without any synthesis across the multiple find locations, without any acknowledgement that similar anomalies in similar contexts were appearing at multiple different excavation sites across the same geological landscape. The dots were never connected. Or, if they were connected, the connection was not published. The relevant reports went into archive. The finds went into storage. The tunnels were poured with concrete and lined with tile and began carrying millions of passengers every year through corridors where, somewhere in the walls above the tunnel roof, things were waiting that we do not yet fully understand. Let me tell you about a man named William Dawson. Sir John William Dawson was the principal of McGill University in Montreal from 1855 to 1893, and he was one of the most important geologists in 19th century North America. He was also a deeply committed Christian who believed that geology would eventually confirm the account of creation in Genesis, which shaped his interpretations in ways that we can now recognize as problematic. But his fieldwork was meticulous, his observations were careful, and his published reports on the geology and archaeology of the St. Lawrence lowlands contain details that have never been fully followed up on. In 1860, Dawson published a paper on what he called the archaeology of the post-Pliocene period in Canada, which is a 19th century way of referring to the period after the last glaciation. In that paper, he described the discovery in the Montreal area of artifacts and bones in geological contexts that he found extremely difficult to interpret within the conventional understanding of human arrival in North America. Dawson was working in an era when it was essentially an article of scientific faith that humans had only recently arrived in the Americas, perhaps a few thousand years at most before the historical period. The idea of a deep human prehistory in North America, one that would rival or exceed the human prehistory of Europe or Asia, was not something most scientists of his era were prepared to entertain. And Dawson himself, with his commitment to a relatively recent biblical creation, was perhaps less prepared than most. But he found things, and he described them, and he published them. And then, as happened to so many anomalous finds of that era, the attention moved elsewhere. The finds were reassigned to later contexts or dismissed as contamination, and the questions Dawson had raised were quietly set aside. What did he find? He found, in deposits associated with what he believed to be a very early period, worked bone and worked stone in contexts that he could not convincingly attribute to any known indigenous group from the historical or even the recent prehistoric period. He found these objects in association with fauna that was itself unusual, animal remains from species that were not known to be present in this region in historical times. He found them in geological contexts that, by his own careful stratigraphic analysis, predated the conventional estimates for human arrival in the Americas by a significant margin. Dawson did not claim to understand what he had found. He reported it accurately, noted that it did not fit the existing framework, and called for further investigation. The further investigation did not come, at least not in the form he was asking for. Instead, his anomalous finds were gradually absorbed into a narrative that minimized their significance. The unusual contexts were attributed to disturbance. The unusual fauna was attributed to misidentification. The dates were pushed later to fit the conventional timeline. This is a pattern that repeats itself in the Montreal story with a regularity that eventually stops feeling coincidental and starts feeling like policy. The underground city of Montreal, the Riso, is usually presented as a triumph of modern urban planning. 33 kilometers of interior passages connecting 10 metro stations, 60 buildings including hotels, office towers, shopping centers, and government facilities, more than 1,200 boutiques and restaurants and services, all of it climate-controlled, all of it accessible to the public, all of it built over roughly 5 decades of continuous development from the 1960s onward. What it is less often presented as is the largest continuous urban archaeological excavation in Canadian history, because that is also what it is. Every tunnel bored, every foundation laid, every underground parking level excavated, every service corridor dug was going through ground that had been occupied by human beings for thousands of years. The full archaeological record of those excavations has never been comprehensively published. Fragments of it appear in grey literature, in municipal planning documents, in the reports of consulting archaeologists who were contracted to observe specific phases of construction. But the synthesis, the comprehensive account of what was found beneath the city during 5 decades of deep excavation, does not exist in any publicly accessible form. I spent a significant amount of time trying to find it. I spoke to people who were involved in the archaeological observation work during various phases of the Risso's development. I contacted the city's Cultural Heritage Office. I reviewed the published literature on Montreal archaeology, which is thinner than it should be for a city of this age and significance. What I found was the outline of something that, if it were fully assembled, would require a rewriting of the accepted history of this place. Let me give you a specific example. During the excavation for the McGill metro station, which sits at the northern end of the oldest part of the underground city, workers encountered an unexpected structural anomaly at a depth significantly below the level of any documented French colonial construction. The anomaly was described in the excavation log as a compacted rubble fill with apparent intentional arrangement. The dimensions of the feature were recorded. A consulting archaeologist was called in. Samples were taken. The feature was photographed, and the construction continued. The samples from that feature, according to the consulting archaeologist's report, which I was able to obtain through a Freedom of Information request, produced radiocarbon dates that fell in a range between approximately 1200 and 1400 years ago, which would put them in the early medieval period in European terms, well before any European presence in North America, but also significantly before the Hochelaga period of Iroquoian occupation that is typically cited as the starting point for complex human settlement on the island of Montreal. The report noted that the radiocarbon dates were inconsistent with the known archaeological sequence for this region. It suggested that the dates might reflect old wood or residual carbon contamination. It recommended further sampling if the construction schedule permitted. The construction schedule did not permit. The feature was photographed, documented, and built over. This is not a rare situation. It is the norm. The compulsion of large infrastructure projects to maintain their timelines means that archaeological anomalies encountered during construction are routinely documented in the minimum required manner and then permanently sealed by whatever structure is being built. The documentation exists, in theory, but it exists in forms that are not easily accessible, not systematically synthesized, and not conducive to the kind of comprehensive analysis that would reveal whether the individual anomalies are isolated incidents or parts of a pattern. The pattern, when you look at enough of the individual reports, is visible, and it points to something that the official history of Montreal has never seriously engaged with, before Jacques Cartier, before the founding of Ville-Marie, before Hochelaga. Before the woodland period, cultures whose pottery and tools appear consistently in the archaeological record going back 2,000 years. Before the archaic period, cultures who occupied this landscape in the aftermath of the glaciers. Before all of that, there is something else on this island, not something alien, not something supernatural, something human. There are signs, in the archaeological record of the island of Montreal and its immediate region, of human activity that is older, more organized, and more architecturally sophisticated than the conventional narrative allows for. Not dramatically older, not tens of thousands of years older, but older enough and organized enough to suggest that the story of how this particular place was used and understood and built upon by human beings begins significantly earlier and involves significantly more complexity than the standard accounts acknowledge. The evidence for this comes from several directions. It comes from the work of Dawson and his contemporaries, which was anomalous even by the standards of their own conservative era. It comes from the archaeological reports generated during the Metro and Riso construction, which contain individually explicable but collectively suggestive anomalies. It comes from the limited systematic archaeology that has been conducted in Old Montreal, particularly the excavations at Pointe-à-Calière, which is now a museum of archaeology and history built on the literal site of the founding of Ville-Marie, at the confluence of the St. Lawrence and the small Rivière Saint-Pierre. The Pointe-à-Calière excavations, which began in earnest in the 1980s in preparation for the museum's opening in 1992, are the most carefully conducted and most fully published archaeology from the Montreal urban core. They represent the closest thing we have to a systematic, scientific examination of what the buried layers beneath Old Montreal actually contain. What they found was remarkable. The deepest levels of the Pointe-à-Calière excavation, going down through the French colonial material and the earlier indigenous material, and into the natural ground surface beneath, revealed a sequence of occupation going back at least 4,000 years at this specific location. 4,000 years of continuous or repeated human use of a single point on the island of Montreal. That in itself is significant. But what was more significant was the character of that oldest occupation. At the deepest level, the archaeologists found evidence of what they interpreted as a substantial residential or ceremonial site from the late Archaic period, roughly 2,000 to 4,000 years before the present. The site included features that suggested permanent or semi-permanent structures, extensive food processing, and the use of non-local materials, indicating trade contacts over considerable distances. This was not a campsite. This was not a brief hunting stop. This was a place that people had invested in, built at, returned to, and maintained for a long time. The report describing these findings, published by the museum in the early 1990s, is careful and cautious in its interpretations. It does not make dramatic claims. It acknowledges the limitations of the evidence. But reading between the careful lines of professional archaeological language, what is being described at Pointe-à-Calière in the late Archaic period is the precursor to Hochelaga. Not the same people, not the same culture, but the same place, being used in a comparable way, for comparable purposes, by people who apparently understood the strategic, ecological, and perhaps spiritual significance of this particular spot on this particular island. Why this spot? The location of Pointe-à-Calière, at the confluence of the St. Lawrence and the Rivière Saint-Pierre, is not simply strategically convenient, although it is that. It is one of those places that appears, across multiple cultures and multiple periods of time, to have been recognized as having a specific kind of importance that transcends its practical advantages. Rivers that join are, in many indigenous cosmologies across North America, considered to be places of power. The joining of waters, the point where two currents become one, is understood in those traditions as a threshold, a place where different realms of existence touch, where the ordinary world and the spirit world are closer to each other than they are in less liminal locations. The French missionaries who established their colony at this specific point, at the confluence of the rivers on the southeastern tip of the island, may have been responding to practical considerations, the sheltered landing, the clean water supply, the defensible position, but they were also, perhaps without knowing it, choosing a place that had been chosen for similar reasons by people who came before them, for reasons that are not entirely practical. The 4,000 years of occupation that the Pointe-à-Calière excavations document is not an accident of geography. It is a record of recognition. People kept coming back to this place, kept building here, kept treating it as significant, not just because it was convenient, but because it was, in some way that the archaeological record can register, but not fully explain, important. And if the deepest levels of the Pointe-à-Calière excavation go back 4,000 years, the question becomes, what sits beneath those levels? The excavation did not go to the geological bottom of the site. It could not without compromising the structures above it and the museum that now occupies the space. The Champlain Sea clay, which would represent the absolute bottom of what is accessible below this part of the island, was reached but not excavated through. What lies between the deepest documented occupation and the marine clay is, at this location, unknown. At other locations across the island, where deeper excavations have occurred for infrastructure purposes, we have hints of what that intermediate zone contains, and some of those hints are very strange indeed. Let me take you to a specific story, a specific account, a specific incident that I want to examine carefully because it illustrates better than anything else the dynamic I have been describing, the way that genuinely anomalous archaeological findings in Montreal have been encountered, noted, and then effectively erased from the ongoing conversation about what this place is and what it contains. In the summer of 1978, during the excavation work for a section of the Metro's Orange Line between the Sherbrooke and Mont Royal stations, a crew working on a service tunnel encountered, at a depth of approximately 8 meters below the current street surface, a section of stonework that did not match any known construction technique from any documented period of Montreal's history. The stones were large, larger than standard colonial-era masonry, and they had been fitted together in a dry stone technique without mortar, in a manner that was precise enough to have survived whatever had caused the surrounding earth to compact around them, and, apparently, to have been integral to some larger structure of which only this section remained. The consulting archaeologist on the project documented the feature carefully. She described the stones as being between 40 and 90 centimeters in their longest dimension, roughly dressed on their joining faces, but left rough on their outer faces, fitted in a pattern that she described as resembling coursed cyclopean masonry, which is the term for a type of prehistoric construction found primarily in the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern archaeological record. She sampled organic material from the soil matrix immediately adjacent to the stonework. She photographed everything comprehensively. She noted that the depth of the feature, combined with the known rate of sediment accumulation in this part of the island, suggested a construction date that she was unwilling to specify in her preliminary report without further analysis. The further analysis was requested but not funded. The Metro project allocated no budget for extended archaeological work at this location. The stonework was photographed, described, and removed piece by piece to make room for the tunnel section it was obstructing. The preliminary report was filed. The samples went to a university laboratory for radiocarbon dating. The results, when they came back several months later, produced a date range that the supervising archaeologist on the Metro project chose to flag as probably anomalous, possibly reflecting contamination of the organic matrix by older carbon. The date range the lab returned was between approximately 2,800 and 3,200 years before present, 3,000 years ago. That is not a date range that any known human occupation of the island of Montreal should be producing from a sophisticated stone structure. The late Archaic period cultures that occupied this landscape 3,000 years ago were mobile hunter-gatherers and seasonal camps. They did not, according to the current consensus, build stone structures of the size and precision that the Metro archaeologist described. The site report was filed. The stones were removed or destroyed in the course of construction. No further investigation was conducted. The radiocarbon dates were appended to the report with the notation that they likely reflected contamination. I want to be very clear about something. I am not claiming that this report proves the existence of a previously unknown advanced civilization beneath Montreal. I am not claiming anything of the sort. What I am claiming is that the report exists, that the feature was documented, that the radiocarbon dates were returned, and that the explanation offered for those dates, contamination, was applied without any subsequent testing to confirm or refute it. And I am claiming that this pattern of anomalous finds being documented, insufficiently analysed, and then explained away with minimum effort, has repeated itself across the archaeological record of this island with a frequency that eventually demands examination. Either Montreal is an extremely unusual concentration of misdated, contaminated, misidentified archaeological features, or something has been happening on this island for longer than we have been willing to acknowledge. Let us talk about the mountain. Mont Royal sits at the centre of the island of Montreal, rising to 233 metres above sea level. It is not a large mountain by any standard. By any standard of comparison with the genuinely dramatic peaks of the Canadian landscape, it is essentially a hill. But it dominates the flat island landscape in a way that is far out of proportion to its actual dimensions. You can see it from every direction. You can orient yourself by it. On a clear day, you can see it from the south shore of the St. Lawrence, a dark presence above the city it names. Cartier climbed it in 1535 and gave it its name. He described the view from its summit as showing him the extent of a populated, cultivated island. He planted a cross at the top, as was the custom, claiming the territory for France and for God in the same gesture. What Cartier did not describe, or perhaps did not understand the significance of what he was seeing, was the existing human modification of the mountain that he was climbing. Mont Royal is not a natural hill in the sense of being an unmodified geological feature. Its summit area and upper slopes show evidence of human modification that goes back at least several thousand years. There are features on the mountain that have been attributed to natural geological processes or to the ordinary debris of long occupation, but which, when examined carefully, suggest deliberate shaping of the landscape on a scale that goes well beyond what any casual or incidental occupation would produce. There are low earthwork features on the mountain's north slope that were noticed by early surveyors in the 19th century and described, tentatively, as possible prehistoric earthworks. These features were largely built over during the park development associated with Frederick Law Olmsted's design for Mont Royal Park in the 1870s, which turned the mountain into the public green space that Montreal is used today. Olmsted, whose most famous work is Central Park in New York, was designing at a time when the North American landscape was being aggressively remade for European aesthetic sensibilities, and when the physical traces of indigenous occupation were typically treated as obstacles to improvement rather than features worth preserving. The earthworks on Montreal's north slope, whatever they were, did not survive the park construction in any clearly readable form. But the surveys conducted before the park work, in the 1850s and 1860s, had documented them with enough precision to confirm that they existed, that they were too regular to be natural, and that they covered a significant area of the mountain's northern face. Who built them? When? For what purpose? The honest answer is that nobody knows, because nobody investigated them properly before they were destroyed. But the patterns that appear on Mont Royal in those early surveys look remarkably similar to earthwork features that are, in other parts of eastern North America, firmly attributed to the Hopewell tradition. The complex of related cultures that built the most elaborate burial mounds and ceremonial earthworks in North American prehistory, primarily in what is now Ohio and surrounding states, but with an influence and trade network that extended over thousands of kilometers. The Hopewell flourished roughly 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. At their peak, they were trading obsidian from the Yellowstone region of the American West, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica from the Appalachians, all across eastern North America. They were building earthwork complexes of astonishing precision and scale. They were burying their dead with grave goods that demonstrate a level of artistic skill and metallurgical knowledge that most people do not associate with the pre-contact Americas. Did the Hopewell influence reach Montreal? Did Hopewell-related peoples occupy this island? Did they modify the mountain and build structures at the confluences of its rivers? The earthworks that were surveyed on Mont Royal's north slope before the Olmsted Park development, and then destroyed during it, are consistent with the Hopewell tradition in their form and probable function. But because they were destroyed before they could be properly excavated, the question cannot be definitively answered. What we have instead are the traces, the survey maps, the descriptions of what was seen before it was buried under park infrastructure, and the persistent geological anomalies in the soils of the mountain's lower slopes, anomalies that show up in core samples and in the limited excavation that has been done for utility installation in the park, anomalies that include unusual concentrations of charcoal and burned bone at depths consistent with features 2,000 years old or more. The mountain that names the city has its own buried history. That history has been even less examined than the buried streets below. Let me tell you about the river that no longer exists. The Rivière Saint-Pierre, which was one of the two rivers at whose confluence the French established their colony, has not existed as a surface river since the mid-19th century. It was culverted, buried, turned into a sewer, and eventually forgotten as a geographical feature by most of the city's population. But it ran, when it existed, from springs in the western part of the island, through the area now occupied by some of Montreal's oldest neighbourhoods, and into the street, Lawrence at the point where Pointe-à-Calière now stands. And along its course, there was a consistent pattern of human occupation going back thousands of years. This is not surprising. Rivers are obvious magnets for human settlement. They provide fresh water, fish, transportation routes, and food-rich edge environments where forest meets water. The Rivière Saint-Pierre was, by any measure, an ideal location for habitation. But the density of archaeological finds along its now-buried course is unusual even by the standards of riverine settlement archaeology. The sites that have been documented, or partially documented, during utility work and construction along the river's former path show an unbroken sequence of occupation from the early post-glacial period through the French colonial era, with no significant gaps. 4,000 years, perhaps more, of continuous human presence along the banks of a small river that no longer exists. And at certain points along that former riverbank, the archaeological material becomes denser and more complex, in ways that suggest the sites along this river were not just ordinary residential locations. There are concentrations of worked stone, of animal bone assemblages indicating systematic processing rather than casual discard, of hearth features clustered in patterns, suggesting communal activity rather than individual household use. These are the traces of what might have been significant gathering places, not just camps, not just fishing spots. Places where people came together in numbers and for purposes that went beyond simple subsistence. The largest such concentration documented from the Rivière Saint-Pierre's former course is located in an area that is now occupied by construction from the 1960s and 70s, urban renewal. that was, from an archaeological standpoint, pure destruction. The site was noted in a pre-construction survey. A small excavation test was opened. The results were described as significant in the survey report. The full excavation that was recommended was never conducted. The construction proceeded. Whatever was there is now permanently inaccessible. The pattern, again, I want to step back from the specific finds and the specific incidents and talk about something broader, something that is, in a sense, more fundamental to the mystery of Montreal than any individual artifact or buried structure. I want to talk about why places matter, because embedded in the conventional history of this city is an assumption that is so rarely examined that most people who repeat it do not realize they are making an assumption at all. The assumption is that the significance of this particular place, this island at the confluence of the Ottawa River with the street, Lawrence, at the foot of this small but dominant mountain, at the center of one of the most ecologically rich freshwater systems in the world, was discovered by Europeans who arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries. Jacques Cartier found this place. Samuel de Champlain understood this place. Maisonneuve built the foundation of what became this city. The history of this place begins when Europeans began writing it down. This assumption is, by the evidence of the archaeological record, profoundly wrong. Not just wrong in the sense that people obviously lived here before Europeans arrived. Everyone accepts that. Wrong in a deeper sense. Wrong in the sense that the importance of this location, its role as a gathering place, a trading hub, a site of political and probably spiritual significance, appears to go back not hundreds but thousands of years. And the people who gathered here, traded here, built here, and understood this place in ways that have only partially survived the colonial period, were not simply the immediate predecessors of Hochelaga. They were the latest expressions of a much longer tradition of recognizing what this island was. That tradition of recognition is not something that can be fully explained by the obvious practical advantages of the location. Yes, the island is strategically placed. Yes, the rivers are navigable. Yes, the ecology is rich. But those practical advantages are shared by dozens of other locations along the Street Lawrence and its tributaries, many of which show no comparable depth of occupation or intensity of use. Something about this specific island, and specifically about the point at the southeastern end of the island, where the rivers meet and the mountain watches, drew human beings back here, again and again, across millennia, and caused them to invest in it in ways that ordinary subsistence economics cannot fully explain. The buried streets of Old Montreal are the most visible expression of this long investment. They are the layer that the 19th century put down over the 18th century, which sat on the 17th century, which sat on the 16th and 15th centuries, which sat on thousands of years of indigenous occupation, which sat on something older still, that we are only beginning to be able to see through the accidental windows opened by infrastructure construction. The buried streets are real. You can walk into certain basements in Old Montreal and see the original ground floor level of buildings from the 1600s. You can see the doorways that were bricked over. You can see the windows whose stone sills are now below your feet. You can feel the weight of the city above you and understand, in a physical way that no book or photograph can fully convey, what it means for a living city to grow up over its own past. But the buried streets are also a metaphor for something larger. They are the most legible page in a book that goes back much further than the French colonial period. And the pages beneath them are written in materials and languages and traditions that we have only barely begun to learn how to read. Now, let me take you inside. Let's go into the actual spaces that exist below Old Montreal, the ones that can be accessed and have been documented, the ones that give you a physical sense of what it means for a city to contain, within itself, a ghost of its earlier self. The most famous of these spaces, at least in terms of public accessibility, is the Pointe-à-Calière Museum complex itself, which was built specifically to incorporate the archaeological layers below it into the museum experience. If you have been there, you know what I am describing. You enter at street level, which is the current 1990s-era museum building, and you descend through the layers. There are walkways over exposed excavation floors. There are preserved wall sections from the French colonial period. There are interpretive panels explaining what each layer represents and when it was deposited. At the deepest accessible level, you are standing in what was once the exterior of the original Ville Marie settlement. At the ground level, as it existed in the 17th century, roughly 12 feet below where you started, it is impressive. It is genuinely moving in a way that most museum experiences are not. because the physical descent through the layers makes the passage of time tangible rather than merely conceptual. You are not reading about history, you are standing in it. But the Pointe-à-Callière experience, for all its strengths, is a curated and interpreted experience. The archaeologists who designed it made choices about what to show and how to frame it. The story it tells is a careful one, focused on the French colonial founding and the indigenous occupation immediately preceding it. The deeper layers, the ones that produce dates of 4,000 years or more, are acknowledged but not prominently featured. They are mentioned in the text panels, summarized in the museum's publications, but they do not dominate the narrative of the space in the way the colonial material does. This is partly an understandable pedagogical choice. The colonial period is the most accessible, the most visually interesting, the most directly connected to the city that visitors come from and return to. The late archaic period is harder to dramatize. Its remains are less visually impressive. Its story requires more explanation. But it is also, perhaps, a choice that reflects the broader tendency I have been describing throughout this exploration, the tendency to foreground the colonial narrative and to allow the pre-colonial layers to exist in the background, present but not insisting on their own significance. Beyond the Pointe-à-Callière, the buried spaces beneath Old Montreal are not generally accessible to the public. They exist in basements of private buildings, in utility corridors, in sealed spaces between foundation walls, but they are there. I spoke to a man who has spent decades working on the restoration and renovation of buildings in Old Montreal, a contractor who has opened more walls and floors in those old buildings than he can count, and who has found, in the course of that work, spaces and features that continue to startle him, even after all his years of experience. He described to me basements beneath basements. Not metaphorically, literally. In several buildings in the oldest part of the district, he has encountered, below the known basement level, older vault spaces that predate the buildings above them. These lower vaults, in the cases he has personally examined, show no direct structural connection to the buildings above. They are not cellars or foundations of the current or most recent previous structure. They are older, built in a different style with different materials, and appear to have been incorporated into or built over by later construction without any documentation of their existence or original purpose. Some of these lower vaults, he told me, show signs of having been in use for significant periods. There is soot on ceilings in locations where no fireplace or chimney exists in the current or immediately preceding building. There is wear on stone floor surfaces, consistent with heavy foot traffic. There are niches cut into walls in locations and configurations that do not match any practical storage function. His best interpretation, offered cautiously, is that some of these lower vault spaces are remnants of 17th century French colonial construction that was built over and forgotten during subsequent renovation. This is plausible for some of them. The French colonial period was not uniformly documented. Buildings were altered, rebuilt, expanded, and sometimes simply overwhelmed by new construction without systematic record-keeping. But for some of the spaces he has encountered, even a 17th century origin does not fit comfortably. The construction techniques in the lower spaces are, in certain cases, different enough from documented French colonial masonry to suggest a different tradition of building or a significantly earlier period. He has photographed these spaces. He has, in a few cases, had archaeologists look at them. The responses he has received have ranged from genuine curiosity and a recommendation for further investigation to polite interest and no follow-up. The further investigation has not happened. The spaces are closed up again in the course of the renovation work that uncovered them. The buildings are restored and reopened. The buried spaces go back to being buried. There is a specific building in Old Montreal that I want to discuss. I am going to be somewhat circumspect about its exact identity, for reasons that will become clear, but I want to describe what is beneath it because it represents, in concrete form, everything I have been talking about in the abstract. The building stands on one of the oldest streets in the district, a street that has been continuously occupied since the mid-17th century. The building itself has a documented history going back to the late 17th century, with multiple phases of construction and renovation in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. It is currently used for commercial purposes and has recently undergone significant renovation. During that renovation, the contractors excavating for new foundation support encountered, at a depth significantly below the existing basement floor, a series of stone features that the project archaeologist described in his required assessment report as anomalous in relation to the documented construction history of the site and surrounding properties. The features included sections of stone wall using a dry stone construction technique similar to what I described earlier from the Metro excavation report. They included a carefully paved stone floor surface covering an area of approximately 30 square meters. They included what appeared to be the remains of a hearth or fire installation positioned at the center of the paved area. Organic material associated with the hearth was sampled. The radiocarbon date returned was in the range of 1,000 to 1,200 years before present, which would place the construction of this feature in approximately the 9th or 10th century of the current era. This is the period that, in eastern North America, corresponds to the Middle Woodland period, when the cultures of this region were producing sophisticated pottery, conducting long-distance trade, and in some areas building earthwork features of considerable complexity. Middle Woodland period peoples could certainly have built stone features. The dry stone construction technique is not unknown from this tradition, but the scale and apparent permanence of this feature, at this location, in what would become the heart of the colonial city, is unusual for what the standard archaeological framework expects from Middle Woodland occupation of this island. The project archaeologist recommended a comprehensive excavation of the features prior to the continuation of the foundation work. The building owner, facing time and cost pressures, declined the recommendation. A compromise was reached in which an abbreviated recording was conducted. The features were photographed and mapped, samples were collected, and the foundation work proceeded, destroying the features in the process. The completed assessment report, which I reviewed, contains a single paragraph noting that the nature and extent of the features encountered suggest that further archaeological potential may exist in the immediate area and in the broader district. It recommends that future construction in the vicinity be subject to archaeological monitoring. The paragraph is accurate, the recommendation is sensible, and it will almost certainly be ignored, as similar recommendations in similar reports have been ignored before it, because the archaeological monitoring requirement does not come with any mechanism for ensuring that what is found during monitoring is fully studied rather than merely noted and sealed over. This is the system as it currently operates, not through malice, not through conspiracy, through the perfectly ordinary friction between the cost of archaeology and the benefit of development, applied consistently across decades and across an entire district that contains more buried history than has ever been properly counted. Let me tell you about the night sky. One of the most persistent and most interesting aspects of the pre-colonial archaeological record from eastern North America is the evidence for astronomical knowledge among the cultures that inhabited this landscape. We tend to think of systematic astronomy as a product of settled, agricultural civilizations, places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Mesoamerica, where the agricultural calendar made tracking the movements of the sun and moon and stars a matter of practical necessity. But the woodland period peoples of eastern North America, including the cultures that occupied the island of Montreal and the Street Lawrence Valley more broadly, show clear evidence of astronomical awareness that goes well beyond casual observation. The alignment of earthwork features to solstice sunrises and sunsets, the orientation of burial mounds to significant celestial positions, the use of astronomical markers in the layout of ceremonial spaces. This is not speculation. It is documented in the archaeological record from dozens of sites across the Northeast and Great Lakes regions, and it raises an interesting question about what we know and do not know about the pre-colonial landscape of the island of Montreal. The mountain at the center of the island is a natural astronomical observatory. From its summit, the horizon is visible in all directions. The positions of sunrise and sunset at the solstices and equinoxes are clearly readable against the distant ridgelines. The mountain's position at the center of a flat island surrounded by flat lowlands makes it uniquely suitable for horizon-based astronomical observation. The earthwork features on the mountain's north slope, which were documented before the Olmsted Park development and then destroyed, were described in the 19th century surveys as being aligned in ways that seemed intentional but that the surveyors could not explain. Looking at those descriptions now, with what we know about woodland period astronomical practices, some of those alignments are consistent with the kind of horizon markers that have been documented at other woodland period sites in the region. Did the people who lived on and around this island use the mountain as an astronomical observation platform? Did they build features on its slopes that functioned as horizon calendars, marking the positions of the rising and setting sun at astronomically significant times of year? We cannot say definitively, because the evidence was destroyed before it could be properly analyzed, but the suggestion is there. The mountain is where you would build such features if you wanted to conduct systematic astronomical observation from this island, and features that might have served that purpose were documented on its slopes before they were built over. The buried history of Montreal is not just a history of streets and buildings and colonial politics. It is also, potentially, a history of how this place was understood cosmologically by the people who recognized its significance long before any European explorer arrived to rename it. The mountain at the center of the island was Mont Royal to the French, but it had other names before that, names whose meanings we do not fully know. Names that may have encoded something about why this particular place, this particular elevation at the center of this particular island, was recognized as being where it needed to be for the purposes it served. I want to return now to the question of what was found beneath Montreal and what happened to those finds, because there is a category of finding from the Montreal excavations that I have not yet discussed directly. A category that is, in some ways, the most remarkable of all, and that has received the least public attention. I am talking about the copper. The Great Lakes region of North America contains one of the largest deposits of native copper on Earth. The copper of Lake Superior's basin, in particular, is a unique geological phenomenon. Copper occurring in pure metallic form that can be worked without smelting, shaped and hammered and formed into objects of considerable sophistication using nothing more than stone tools and heat. This copper was being worked by human beings in this region for more than 7,000 years before European contact. The Old Copper Complex, as archaeologists call it, represents the earliest known systematic use of metalworking in North America. It predates the more famous copper traditions of the Midwest by thousands of years. People in the Great Lakes region were making sophisticated copper tools and ornaments, spear points and knives and awls and gorgets and bracelets, as far back as 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. The Old Copper Complex is one of the most extraordinary technological achievements of the pre-contact Americas, and it is one of the least known. It does not fit the conventional narrative of North American prehistory, which tends to emphasize the relative technological simplicity of hunter-gatherer cultures and to reserve complex metallurgy for the agricultural civilizations of Mesoamerica and South America. But Old Copper Complex objects appear across a wide geographic range, traded from their Great Lakes source across thousands of kilometers. They appear in sites in New England and in the Southeast and in the Plain States, and they appear, in small but consistent numbers, in archaeological contexts along the street. Lawrence River Corridor, including in sites that are within the modern territory of the island of Montreal and its immediate region. Copper objects from the Old Copper Complex tradition, or from related later copper working traditions, have been found during construction and excavation work in the Montreal area. The finds are not large in number. They represent isolated artifacts rather than evidence of local copper working activity, but they are there, in the reports, in the grey literature, in the collections of provincial and federal museums. They are there, and their presence means something. It means that the people who occupied this island, across a span of thousands of years, were connected to a trade network that extended to the Great Lakes and probably beyond. It means that this place was not an isolated backwater on the margins of North American prehistoric culture. It was a point on routes that ran across the continent, through which goods and ideas and people moved over distances that most modern people do not associate with pre-contact indigenous life. The copper finds from the Montreal region are not individually dramatic. A single worked copper awl is not going to make international headlines. But their consistent presence across multiple sites and multiple time periods is one more piece of evidence that the story of this place is older, more connected, and more sophisticated than the official history has yet acknowledged. And some of those copper finds were made during the Metro and Reso excavations, and some of them were documented in reports that went into archives. And some of those archives have not been systematically reviewed in decades. The underground city of Montreal is genuinely strange if you spend time in it with historical awareness. You walk through the Reso and you are moving through a space that was created entirely in the second half of the 20th century. A rationalized, climate-controlled, efficiently navigated underground pedestrian network that makes total practical sense in a city with Montreal's winters. It is a triumph of utilitarian urban design, and it is built on top of, and in some cases literally through, one of the densest archaeological landscapes in Canada. The juxtaposition is dizzying if you let yourself feel it. You are walking through polished granite and neon-lit food courts and chain pharmacies and boutique shoe stores, and beneath your feet, separated from the contemporary world by varying thicknesses of concrete and compressed earth, there are spaces and features that were deposited by human beings who knew this landscape in a completely different way, who understood the rivers that no longer exist, who oriented themselves by a mountain that now has a cross on it and a road to the summit, who used copper objects traded from 1,000 kilometers away, who buried their dead with red ochre and bone ornaments at sites that are now parking garages. The underground city is, in a profound sense, a second burial of the history that is already buried. The street raising of the 19th century put one layer between the colonial past and the present. The construction of the Riso in the 20th century put another layer between everything before it and the city as it now exists. Each layer added makes the one below it more inaccessible, more remote, more thoroughly sealed away. But sealed is not the same as gone. The things that are beneath the Riso, beneath the metro, beneath the raised streets of Old Montreal are still there. In some cases, they are extraordinarily well preserved. The cold, dark, dry conditions of deep urban burial can maintain organic materials for centuries or millennia. There are wooden objects down there, there are leather objects, there are textiles, there are food remains. There are, potentially, things that would dramatically change our understanding of the history of this place and this continent, waiting for the combination of will, resources, and technology that would make their recovery possible. That combination has not yet appeared, but it will, because cities eventually have to deal with their own infrastructure in ways that create opportunities for archaeology, however disruptive and expensive those opportunities are. The oldest parts of the metro system are now 60 years old. The concrete of those tunnels ages. The stations require renovation. When the work begins, if there is sufficient awareness and sufficient political will to require proper archaeological monitoring, some of what was sealed in the 1960s will become accessible again. The question is whether, when that access becomes available, we will be asking the right questions. Whether we will be looking for the full range of what might be there, not just the colonial material and the Iroquoian material, but the older, stranger, more difficult material that falls outside the comfortable narrative of this place's history. There is a word used in French-Canadian historical tradition, mémoire, memory. The French concept of cultural memory is tied to place in a way that English North American culture has often found difficult to articulate. For the French-speaking Quebecois, the places where they have lived and worked and buried their dead are not just real estate. They are repositories of identity, of story, of the specific kind of time that a community inhabits. This sense of place as memory is one of the reasons why the heritage preservation movement in Quebec has been more aggressive than in most of Canada. The Quebecois understand, intuitively and culturally, that losing the physical fabric of old places is not just an aesthetic loss, it is a loss of self. When old buildings disappear, when old streets are altered beyond recognition, when the material record of the past is paved over and built over and buried under, what disappears with them is the community's ability to know where it came from and therefore who it is. But this profound sensitivity to cultural memory operates, in Montreal's case, within a specific cultural frame. The memoir that Quebec's heritage institutions protect is primarily French-Canadian memory. The buildings, the streets, the spaces that are designated, documented, and preserved are predominantly the ones associated with the French colonial project and its aftermath. The pre-colonial past is acknowledged in the heritage framework, but it is acknowledged as other, as the past of peoples whose descendants are still present, but whose relationship to the institutions of heritage preservation has been fraught and unequal. What this means in practice is that the 12 feet of fill that raised the streets of Old Montreal in the 19th century has a very different status in the heritage discourse than the thousands of years of indigenous occupation that sit below it. The raised street level is documented, recognized, and partially interpreted for public understanding. The deeper layers, the ones that contain the majority of this place's actual historical depth, are not quite invisible, but are not quite seen. This is not a failure of the individuals who work in heritage preservation in Montreal. Many of them are passionate, dedicated, and genuinely committed to understanding the full complexity of this place's past. It is a failure of the frameworks within which they operate. Frameworks that were built at a time when the history that mattered was European history and that have been reformed but not fundamentally reconceived in the decades since. The buried streets of Old Montreal are extraordinary. The human drama they represent, the decision to simply build higher, to seal off the world below and start fresh above it, is genuinely fascinating and well worth understanding. But they are the most recent of many burials, the latest in a series of decisions to move forward by putting the past underfoot. Every culture that has occupied this island has, in one way or another, built on top of what came before. The French built over Hochlager or over whatever had replaced it. The Iroquoians of Hochlager built over earlier Iroquoian occupation and over the woodland period sites beneath that. The woodland period peoples built over the archaic period peoples. Each layer both preserves and obscures what is beneath it. The result is a stratigraphy of human presence that is extraordinarily rich, and that, in the sections where careful archaeology has been possible, tells a story that is orders of magnitude more complex and more ancient than the popular understanding of this place allows for. The story beneath the streets is not just the story of colonial Montreal preserved in aspect below the Victorian street improvements. It is a story of human beings returning, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, to a place they recognized as significant and layering their own contribution on top of what their predecessors had left. We are part of that story too. The things being built in Montreal today will eventually be someone else's buried layer. The Réseau, the metro, the towers and stadiums and highways, all of it will someday be archaeological material, read by people who will wonder what it meant and what kind of beings built it. They will find it easier to wonder about us if we take the time, now, to understand what came before us, and to resist the comfortable convenience of building over our own past without asking what we are sealing away in the darkness beneath our feet. The Sulpician priests who ran the seigneury of Montreal Island from the late 17th century onward were among the most educated and methodical record keepers in the colonial North American world. The Sulpicians maintained detailed accounts of the land under their control, the properties and their histories, the boundaries and the landmarks, the features of the landscape that mattered for both practical and spiritual purposes. Among those records, scattered through the archives of the Grand Séminaire de Montréal, which still exists and still maintains its remarkable historical collection, there are occasional references to features of the landscape that do not correspond to anything in the documented Indigenous or colonial record. I am going to describe a few of these references. In a land description from the late 17th century, concerning a property in the lower town of the settlement, a Sulpician administrator noted the presence of certain stoneworks of ancient appearance in the ground exposed during the digging of a new cellar. He described these stoneworks as not being the product of French construction and as being of greater age than the memory of the settlement. He noted that the Indian guides he consulted about the features were unable to identify them as the work of their own people or of any people known to them. This is a remarkable statement. The Sulpician administrator was saying, in the careful administrative language of a 17th century colonial bureaucrat, that the local indigenous people, who presumably had extensive knowledge of this landscape going back many generations, had no knowledge of who had built the stone features he was looking at. A second reference, from early in the 18th century, describes the discovery during the construction of a new building of what the Sulpician writer calls a floor of stone, ancient and of unknown manufacture. He notes that this floor was found at a depth of approximately 8 feet below the then current ground surface. He describes the stones as being fitted together with a precision that he compares to the masonry of certain old buildings he had seen in France, though he notes that the technique is not identical. A third reference, from mid-18th century, mentions the collapse of a section of ground near the riverfront that revealed a space of apparent construction of considerable dimensions whose age cannot be determined. The writer notes that the space was examined by several members of the community, including one with medical training who apparently had some acquaintance with antiquarian subjects, and that the consensus was that the feature predated any known occupation of the island. These 3 references, spread across roughly 60 years of Sulpician administrative records, are not isolated. There are others, less detailed, that mention unexplained features encountered during construction or groundwork in the lower town. Collectively, they suggest that the early colonial settlers of Montreal were regularly encountering, in the course of building their own city, evidence of something that had existed before them and that they could not explain. What the Sulpicians made of these encounters is not entirely clear. The administrative language is careful and non-committal. There is no sense of the kind of dramatic excitement that we might expect if the colonists believed they had found evidence of a lost civilization, but there is also no dismissal, no attribution of the features to natural processes or to misidentification. The writers describe what they see with the measured precision of men trained in observation and record-keeping, and what they describe is consistently anomalous. These records sit in the Grand Séminaire archive. They have been read by historians of the colonial period, who tend to treat them as interesting curiosities but not as evidence of anything that requires revision of the standard historical narrative. They have been read by a small number of archaeologists who have noted them with interest but have not been in a position to conduct excavations that might either confirm or contradict what the Sulpicians describe. They sit there, in the archive, written in careful 18th century French on paper that has survived 300 years. They are patient in the way that archives are patient. They are waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The deepest question in all of this is one that archaeology, with its commitment to empirical rigor and its appropriate caution about speculation, cannot fully answer. And that question is, what is the relationship between the physical place and the persistence of human significance? Why do certain places keep attracting human presence across thousands of years? Why does the island of Montreal, and specifically the southeastern tip of that island, where the rivers meet and the mountain watches, generate a continuous record of human attention and investment going back to the earliest periods of post-glacial occupation? The practical answer involves the confluence of fresh water sources, the sheltered harbour, the access to rich ecological zones, the position at the junction of major river systems that served as the primary transportation network of the continent. These are real advantages. They help explain why people chose this place, but they do not fully explain why people kept choosing it. The practical advantages of the Montreal location are shared, as I noted earlier, by numerous other sites in the street. Lawrence system. Most of those sites do not show the same depth of occupation or the same intensity of investment. There is something else here. Something that the practical explanation does not capture. In some traditions, this kind of persistent human significance is attributed to the spiritual character of the place itself. In indigenous North American cosmologies, certain places are understood to be inherently powerful, to be locations where the boundaries between different orders of reality are thinner than usual, where access to spiritual resources is more available. These places are typically at confluences, at the bases of significant mountains, at springs, at sites of geological and ecological transition. The island of Montreal meets all of these criteria. It is at a major confluence. It has a mountain at its centre. It has springs and wet areas at multiple points. It sits at one of the most dramatic ecological transition zones in eastern North America, where the temperate deciduous forest zone meets the St. Lawrence River system. And it has, over thousands of years, attracted human beings who invested in it with a consistency that suggests they recognize something in this place that transcended the merely practical. Whether that recognition reflects spiritual reality or the deeply human tendency to invest significance in places that are already distinguished by practical value is a question that cannot be answered from the outside. It requires the kind of knowledge that comes from long relationship with a place, from the accumulated generations of experience and story and understanding that a community builds over time. The community that has the longest relationship with the island of Montreal is not the French colonial community, for all their memoir. It is the indigenous community whose ancestors occupied this place for thousands of years before the French arrived. The Mohawk people, who are one of the contemporary inheritors of the Iroquoian tradition that includes the Hochelaga period, have their own knowledge of this island and what it means. The Anishinaabe peoples, including the Algonquin and Nipissing, who were present when the French arrived, have their own relationship to this landscape and their own understanding of its significance. That knowledge has not been systematically incorporated into the archaeological and heritage understanding of this place. It exists in oral tradition, in ceremony, in the cultural memory of communities that have survived colonization and dispossession and the deliberate destruction of their cultural institutions. It is not the kind of knowledge that gets cited in academic papers or quoted in heritage reports, but it is knowledge about this place, and it is knowledge that is potentially several thousand years deeper than anything the written record or the archaeological excavation can access. The buried streets of Old Montreal are remarkable. The stone features found during metro construction are remarkable. The Sulpician records of unexplained ancient stonework are remarkable, but they are all, in some sense, the material residue of what was originally something more than material. They are the physical traces of a relationship between human beings and this place that was expressed in architecture and artifact, because human beings always eventually express their most important relationships in material form. The meaning comes first, the building comes second. Understanding what is buried beneath Montreal requires not just better archaeology, though better archaeology would help enormously. It requires a willingness to recognize that the people who built here, across thousands of years and multiple cultural traditions, were not building randomly or purely practically. They were building in response to something about this place that they recognized, and that we have mostly lost the capacity to perceive directly. The buried streets preserve the material form of that response. The recognition that generated the response is something we have to reconstruct from the outside, through whatever fragments of evidence remain. Let me tell you about the wells. In the archaeology of early colonial settlements, wells are among the most valuable features for understanding the character and chronology of a site. A well is a deep, stratigraphically complex feature that often preserves organic material in exceptional condition because the waterlogged environment at the bottom prevents the oxidation that normally destroys wood, leather, seeds, and other perishable materials. The wells of Old Montreal are legendary among archaeologists who work in eastern Canada, both for their quantity — there were dozens of them in the original colonial settlement — and for the quality of preservation they have yielded when they have been excavated. But the wells of Old Montreal have another quality that is less often discussed. They go deeper than they need to. A well for domestic water supply in the colonial period typically needed to be dug to the depth of the local water table, plus a safety margin for seasonal variation. In the lower town of Old Montreal, that depth is typically between 4 and 8 meters below the original ground surface. Most of the wells that have been excavated fall in that range for their functional depth. But some of them go deeper. Not all of them, and not dramatically deeper, but several of the wells examined during archaeological work in the district show a pattern of construction that is difficult to explain purely in terms of functional water supply. They have a standard upper section, functional, well-lined, clearly intended for water collection. And then, below the functional section, the well shaft continues, sometimes for several additional meters, narrowing and changing in its construction character into a zone where water supply is not the evident purpose. What is the purpose of digging a well deeper than it needs to go for water? Several possibilities suggest themselves. Access. Storage. In some historical and prehistorical contexts, deep pits are dug as food storage facilities, exploiting the constant cool temperature of deep earth for preservation of perishable goods. But the configurations of the deeper sections of these Montreal wells do not match documentary descriptions of colonial period food storage pits, which are typically wider at the base to maximize storage volume rather than narrowing as these deeper sections do. Another possibility, suggested by the distribution of fine material in the deeper sections, is ritual deposition. The deliberate placement of objects in wells as offerings has a long history in many cultures, both indigenous, North American, and European. Objects have been found in the deeper sections of several old Montreal wells that are not typical domestic debris. They include animal bones in configurations that suggest deliberate arrangement rather than casual discard. They include objects made from non-local materials, the kind of exotic goods that in many archaeological contexts indicate items of special significance rather than ordinary utility. And in one case, the object found in the deepest section of a well in Old Montreal, an object that was documented in a grey literature report from a renovation project in the 1990s, and that the supervising archaeologist described as unusual and of unclear cultural affiliation, was a worked copper object. A copper object at the bottom of a well in Old Montreal, in a context that the stratigraphy placed at the earliest period of the well's use, in the mid to late 17th century. A copper object of a type that the supervising archaeologist could not immediately match to any known French colonial or known contemporary indigenous artifact type. The object was documented, photographed, and transferred to the collection of a provincial museum where it has sat in storage, as far as I can determine, ever since. The museum's collections are not fully digitized. The object does not appear in any published catalogue or database that I have been able to access. The report that documents it is in a grey literature archive that is not publicly searchable. The copper object exists. It has been in storage for approximately 30 years. Nobody has published a proper analysis of it. This is the archaeology of Old Montreal in miniature. The find, the documentation, the storage, the silence. I want to take a few minutes to talk about the specific experience of being in the buried spaces beneath Old Montreal, because I think the experiential dimension of this story is important and tends to get lost in the documentation. The people who have spent time in the excavated or accessible basement levels of the oldest buildings in the district describe the experience consistently in terms that go beyond the purely archaeological. They describe a sense of compressed time, of standing in a place that contains, in its stones and its air and its dimensions, the accumulated presence of everyone who has ever been in that space. Some of this is psychology. We know that being in old, enclosed spaces tends to activate a particular kind of imaginative engagement that open or modern spaces do not. The physical characteristics of an old stone basement, the uneven floors, the irregular walls, the smell of damp and mineral and age, trigger associations and imaginative responses that modern environments do not. But some of it is also simply the reality of what these spaces are. They are not metaphorically old, they are actually old. The stones of the walls were cut and laid by human beings who lived in a world that is in many ways completely alien to ours, and who walked through these spaces with concerns and purposes and understandings of the world that we can only partially reconstruct. The space itself is a kind of evidence, not the kind that can be radiocarbon dated or subjected to spectrographic analysis, but evidence nonetheless. Evidence that human beings lived here, felt things here, made decisions here that had consequences that are still playing out. I have spoken to a woman who works as an archaeologist in Quebec and who has conducted monitoring work in several Old Montreal building renovations over the course of her career. She described to me an experience that has stayed with her for years, from early in her career, during a monitoring assignment in a building on one of the oldest streets in the district. The renovation had opened a section of floor in the deepest accessible basement, exposing a sequence of deposits going back to the 17th century. She was alone in the basement, going through the exposed section carefully, when she noticed something about the quality of the silence. It was, she said, different from ordinary silence, more present, more weighted, and from somewhere below the point she was working at, she could hear water, not dripping, running, a sound that was consistent with an active underground water flow, but that was coming from a location where no known water feature had been documented in any of the historical or archaeological records of the site. She reported the sound to the project manager. A brief investigation concluded that it was probably a leaking pipe from the building's infrastructure, but she noted that the sound's character was not consistent with pipe leakage, which tends to be intermittent and location-specific, but was rather a consistent flow sound that seemed to come from beneath the excavated section of floor, from below the level she was working at. The investigation did not go further. The floor was closed up. The building renovation proceeded. The river that no longer exists, the Rivière Saint-Pierre, was channeled underground during the 19th century, and its channeled course runs in approximately the right direction relative to the building she was describing. Whether she was hearing water flowing through that old 19th century culvert, or something older, something that predated the culverting, a remnant flow through a geological channel that the buried river occupied before it was managed by human infrastructure, is not something that can be determined from her account, but the sound was there, and the sound came from below. And below is where the story of this place keeps going, every time anyone tries to find its bottom. There is one more thread I want to pull on before we begin to draw this toward its conclusion. The city of Montreal has, in recent years, been conducting a significant infrastructure renewal project that involves the replacement of water mains, sewer lines, and other buried utilities across large parts of the city, including in Old Montreal. This work is not primarily archaeological in its mandate, but it involves extensive trenching and excavation at depths that routinely reach the historical archaeological layers in the older districts. The protocol for archaeological monitoring during this utility work exists, in theory. There are requirements for heritage impact assessment. There are provisions for archaeological observation. In practice, the monitoring is inconsistent. The pace of utility replacement work does not accommodate careful archaeological examination. Significant features are encountered, noted, and covered over before they can be properly studied. But some things get through the cracks. A worker on one of the utility replacement projects in Old Montreal, a man I spoke to who has been doing this kind of underground infrastructure work for close to 20 years, described to me an encounter from several years ago that he has not been able to stop thinking about. He was working in a trench approximately 2 meters deep on a street in the oldest part of the district when the backhoe operator called him over. The bucket had exposed something in the trench wall that was not the usual mix of fill, stone, and old infrastructure. It was, he said, a surface. A prepared surface. A section of what appeared to be a stone-flagged floor or pavement, running roughly parallel to the current street surface, but at a depth of approximately 2 meters below it. The surface extended laterally beyond the width of the trench. Its longitudinal extent in the direction of the street was not visible, because the trench was narrow and the surface disappeared into the intact soil on both sides of the excavation. The stones were larger than any flagging he had seen in utility trench work before, averaging perhaps 40 centimeters square. They were well dressed on their upper faces and fitted together tightly without mortar. He took photographs with his phone. He called the site supervisor. The site supervisor called someone who he described as an archaeologist, though the man was not certain of the professional identity of the person who arrived. The person examined the surface, took some photographs, said that it appeared to be older material and that the relevant authorities would be notified, and left. The trench was filled. The utility work continued. No further notification reached the workers. The man showed me his phone photographs, taken in the trench. They show a section of closely fitted stone surface, definitely not modern construction, at the depth he described. The stones are well worked. The joints are tight. The character of the surface is consistent with intentional, skilled masonry from a pre-modern period. What it is not consistent with is the expected stratigraphy of a street in Old Montreal at that depth. At 2 meters below the current surface, in that location, the expected material is either 19th century fill associated with the street raising or French colonial construction from the 17th or 18th century. Neither of those periods is associated with the type of stone surface visible in the photographs, which shows no evidence of the mortar-bonded construction typical of French colonial masonry, and no evidence of the brick and rubble fill typical of the 19th century street raising. What it looks like, to an eye trained in pre-contact North American archaeology, is something from the woodland period or earlier. Something made by people who worked stone without the benefit of metal tools or mortar, who knew how to select stones of appropriate size and shape for a fitted dry stone surface, and who produced work that was precise enough to have survived 2,000 years of burial in good enough condition to be recognizable when a backhoe accidentally exposed it. The photographs exist. The man who took them is credible and has no particular agenda. The surface he photographed was real. It is now buried again, under 2 meters of fill and utility infrastructure, in the heart of Old Montreal, on one of the oldest streets in the city, and nobody has published anything about it. Let me go back to the mountain one more time, not as an archaeological site this time, but as a fact of the landscape. Because the mountain is something that every version of this story returns to, and I think that return is significant. Mont Royal is not special because Europeans named it. It was already special. It was already the organizing principle of the island's geography, the thing that gives the island its identity, its center, its orientation point. Every culture that has lived on this island has had to reckon with the mountain because the mountain is simply there, impossible to ignore, defining the relationship of everything on the island to everything else. The French settlers named it and built a cross on it, and eventually built a Catholic basilica near its base, and a cemetery on one of its flanks, and a university at its feet, and a public park on its summit. All of that layering of Christian and colonial significance on the mountain did not change what the mountain was before any of that happened. Before any of that happened, the mountain was a place where people went to see the whole island at once, to see, on a clear day, the distant shores of the St. Lawrence, to see the rivers running to the sea, to see, at the right time of year, the sun rising and setting at specific positions on the horizon that marked the divisions of the year, the solstices, the equinoxes, the cross-quarter days that divided the agricultural and hunting calendar into its fundamental units. The mountain was a clock, a calendar, an observatory, not in the mechanistic sense of those words, but in the experiential sense. It was the place from which the whole of the island's reality could be perceived at once, the place where the relationship between the island and the sky was most legible. Whether this was an indigenous understanding of the mountain, whether the earthworks on its slopes that were documented before the Olmsted Park development were intended to formalize and perpetuate that understanding, whether the specific points on its summit that command the widest views were used as observation platforms for the systematic tracking of celestial events, is not something that can be definitively determined from the evidence that survives. But the mountain's geographic character is not ambiguous. It commands the island, it commands the sky, and the people who recognized the significance of the island's southeastern tip, the point where the rivers meet, would also have recognized the significance of the mountain above it. The two would have been understood in relation to each other. The point where the waters join, the height from which everything can be seen, the axis mundi, and the gathering place. The sky and the earth meeting at the margins of an island in a river. This is not mythology. This is geography. The mountain and the confluence are the two defining features of the island's landscape, and any culture that lived here long enough to understand the landscape would have understood them in relation to each other. The buried streets of Old Montreal sit at the base of the mountain, at the point where the colonial city meets the landscape that preceded it. Below those streets, in the layers that go down through French colonial construction and Iroquoian occupation and woodland period sites and late archaic camps, there is the residue of a relationship between human beings and this specific landscape that has endured for thousands of years. We have barely begun to read that residue. There is something I need to say about the idea of forbidden history, which is the framing that a lot of content about pre-colonial North America falls into, and which I want to be careful about while also being honest about why it has appeal. The forbidden history framing assumes that there is a deliberate suppression of evidence about the pre-contact Americas, a coordinated effort by academic institutions and government agencies to prevent the public from knowing about ancient civilizations or anomalous archaeological finds that would challenge the mainstream narrative. This framing is seductive because it explains, in a single clean narrative, why the evidence is sparse. It is being hidden. But the reality, as I hope this exploration has illustrated, is both more mundane and more troubling than deliberate suppression. The evidence is not being hidden. It is being inadequately preserved, inadequately funded, inadequately synthesized, and inadequately incorporated into public understanding. The individual archaeologists who encounter anomalous finds are not told to conceal them. They document them, file their reports, and move on to the next project, because the system in which they work does not allocate the resources necessary to fully investigate every anomaly. The reports accumulate in archives. The archives are not adequately digitized or indexed. The synthesis that would reveal the pattern in the anomalies is not being done because it requires resources and institutional commitment that do not exist. The result of this system is not a conspiracy. It is a chronic, structural underinvestment in the archaeology of a place that deserves far more serious attention than it has received. And the result of that underinvestment is that the public's understanding of the history of this specific island, and by extension of pre-contact North American history more broadly, is shaped by an account that is incomplete in ways that we can now begin to measure. The incompleteness is not because the true story is too threatening to tell. The incompleteness is because telling the full story requires sustained commitment, resources, and intellectual openness that have not been consistently applied. The story that emerges from the full evidence, as best as we can currently reconstruct it, is not that an advanced civilization secretly built stone structures beneath Montreal 3,000 years ago, and that this proves something that the academic establishment wants to suppress. The story is considerably stranger and more interesting than that. The story is that this specific place has been recognized as significant by human beings for an extraordinarily long time, that the forms of that recognition have changed across cultures and periods, but that the recognition itself has been continuous, that the physical evidence of that continuous recognition is buried in layers beneath the city that currently occupies the island's surface, and that the deepest layers of that evidence are consistent with a depth and complexity of pre-contact occupation in this part of North America that the standard historical narrative has not yet fully integrated. That is a story worth telling. That is a story that deserves the kind of comprehensive, well-funded, collaborative archaeological investigation that it has not yet received. And that story does not require anything supernatural or conspiratorial to be remarkable. It requires only the willingness to take the evidence seriously and to ask the questions that the evidence generates, wherever those questions lead. The winter of Montreal is famous. The weight of the snow, the sheer duration of the cold, the particular quality of light that Montreal gets between November and March, when the sun stays low and everything has a blue-grey edge to it even at noon. The underground city was built for that winter. The buried streets were partly raised to deal with the flooding that came with the spring thaw. The city's relationship with the cold is fundamental to its character, but the winter was there before the city. The cold was there before the French arrived. The snow and the freeze and the spring flood and the summer heat and the brief, brilliant autumn were the conditions that shaped everything that came before the colonial settlement. Everything in those buried layers, everything that the thousands of years of pre-contact occupation of this island had to reckon with every cycle of the year. The people who lived here before the French did not have underground cities to retreat to. They had fire. They had tailored clothing. They had the knowledge to read the seasons accurately enough to prepare for them. They had the social organization to get through the winters as communities when individual survival would have been impossible. What they built, the structures whose traces appear in the archaeological record, were built to last through those winters and to function within that seasonal cycle. The stone features that appear in the Metro excavation reports and the contractors' accounts and the Sulpician records were built to survive the freeze-thaw cycles of a Montreal winter, which are among the most severe in the temperate world. Dry stone construction, fitted without mortar, is actually better suited to freeze-thaw conditions than mortared masonry, because it can absorb and release the stresses of repeated freezing without cracking. The builders of those features understood the climate they were building in. This is one more piece of evidence that what was built here was built by people who knew this place intimately, not visitors, not a single group passing through, people who had been here long enough to understand what a Montreal winter would do to a poorly constructed building, and who had developed the technical knowledge to build against that understanding. 3,000 years is a long time to live in a place and learn its winters. I want to end where we began, below the streets. There is a specific moment in the experience of descending into the archaeological layers beneath Old Montreal that I have heard described by multiple people in similar terms. It is the moment when you are deep enough below the current street level that the sounds of the city above are no longer audible, when the traffic and the voices and the mechanical hum of contemporary urban life have faded to nothing, and you are in a space that has its own acoustic character, the particular quality of sound absorption that old stone and compressed earth produce. In that silence, if you are quiet enough and still enough, there is something. Not a ghost, not a supernatural presence, not anything that requires belief in the non-material to explain. There is the accumulated history of the space you are in. There is the fact that this specific volume of air, these specific stones, this specific arrangement of space, has been here for a very long time and has been witness to things that no living human has witnessed. The silence down there is full, in a way that the silence of modern spaces is not, because the silence down there has 3,000 years or more of content behind it. The buried streets of Old Montreal are, on one level, a fascinating piece of urban engineering history. The decision to raise the street level, the mechanics of how it was done, the way it preserved the colonial city in its own basement. These are interesting. But they are interesting the way the top layer of an onion is interesting. Real, tangible, worth examining, but not the whole story, not even close to the whole story. Beneath the raised streets is the original colonial city, the one Maisonneuve built, the one that the Sulpicians administered, the one whose priests wrote about finding unexplained ancient stonework in their cellars. Beneath that is Hochelaga, or what came after Hochelaga when it vanished, the traces of Iroquoian occupation that stretches back centuries before Cartier arrived and found his city of thousands. Beneath that is the woodland period material, the fired pottery and the worked bone, and, in the relevant locations, the copper objects from a trade network that stretched to the Great Lakes. Beneath that is the late archaic material, the 4,000-year-old camps and residential sites that the Pointe-à-Calière excavation found at its deepest accessible level. Beneath that is the older material, the anomalous finds from the Metro and Riso excavations, the stone features with radiocarbon dates from 2,000 to 3,000 years before the late archaic occupations, the ash layers and the modified ground surfaces that appear in the transition zone toward the Champlain Sea clay. And beneath all of that, below the marine clay that represents the bottom of the easily readable record, is geological time. 10,000 years of post-glacial landscape, and before that the glacier itself, and before the glacier the warm periods that preceded it, and before those the earlier glaciations, and before those a landscape that no human being ever walked on. We are near the top of that sequence. We are living on the surface, in the most recent layer, the one that has not yet been buried. And the weight of everything below us, all those layers of human presence and meaning and investment and loss, is something that we feel dimly as a kind of inexplicable gravity towards certain places, a sense that certain spots matter more than they should, a recognition that reverberates in us before we can explain why. The island of Montreal is one of those places. The southeastern tip of that island, where the rivers met and the mountain watched, is one of those spots. The buried streets are real. The buried buildings are real. The buried features whose dates do not fit the standard story are real. And the recognition that generated all of those layers, the human compulsion to return to this place and build here and invest in it across thousands of years, is as real as any of it. What has never been shown is not simply the physical reality of what lies beneath. What has never been shown is the full depth of what this place has been to human beings across the whole span of our occupation of this continent. The archaeology exists to tell that story, in fragments, in reports, in archives, in samples, in storage, in photographs on a construction worker's phone. The synthesis that would assemble those fragments into the full story has not yet been done. When it is, The story it tells will require us to revise what we think we know about this place, about the pre-contact history of this continent, and about the depth of the human relationship to specific landscapes that has shaped the course of everything that came after. The streets were raised, the city built over its own past, and the past, compressed and preserved and silent in the dark below, is waiting for us to come down and read it. We haven't yet, but the lights are there, and the time, eventually, comes. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments where you are in the world right now. What city, what time, whether it is snowing, whether you can see stars. I read them all. And if you want more stories like this one, the ones that go down instead of up, the ones that ask what is underneath instead of what was built on top, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The underground is full, and we are only beginning to explore it. End of script. There is a tradition in archaeology of something called ethnoarchaeology, which is the study of living cultures in order to understand the material remains left by past cultures. The basic premise is that if you want to understand what a pottery sherd, or a stone tool, or a fire pit tells you about the people who made it, you should look at how contemporary peoples who live in comparable ways use comparable objects and create comparable features. The material analogues help you interpret the archaeological material you cannot observe in use. Ethnoarchaeology has limits, obvious ones, because contemporary cultures are not frozen versions of past cultures, and because projecting from one to the other risks all kinds of anachronistic and culturally reductive interpretations. But the basic principle, that understanding how people live helps you understand what they leave behind, is sound. I want to apply a version of that principle here, but in reverse. Instead of looking at living cultures to understand the past, I want to look at what the past record of Montreal tells us about how people understood and used this place. And then ask what that tells us about the place itself, because there is a pattern in the archaeological record of the island of Montreal across all the periods and all the cultural traditions that have been identified in that record that is striking when you look for it. And the pattern is this: the things that were built here across thousands of years and multiple cultural traditions consistently reflect an understanding of the place as more than just a convenient habitation site. The scale of investment is too great for pure subsistence logic to explain. You do not build sophisticated stone features at a site unless you expect to return to it. You do not maintain trade networks that bring copper from the Great Lakes to this specific island unless this island occupies a specific place in your understanding of the world that justifies the investment. You do not conduct the large-scale communal feasting and ceremonial activity that some of the bone assemblages from the Montreal archaeological record suggest unless this place is understood as a gathering point, a site where communities come together for purposes that are as much social and spiritual as practical. All of this points to what archaeologists call a central place, a location that functions as a hub in a network, a place that people orient themselves toward rather than simply passing through or casually occupying. Central places exist in every human landscape, in every period of human history. They are the places where things happen, where decisions are made, where exchanges occur that matter not just for the individuals involved, but for the broader communities those individuals represent. The island of Montreal, and specifically the southeastern point of that island, appears to have functioned as a central place across multiple successive cultures and multiple successive millennia. The Hochelaga that Cartier visited was the most recent and the most visible expression of that central place function, but the archaeological evidence suggests that Hochelaga was not creating a new central place when it was built. It was inhabiting and elaborating an older one. This has implications for how we should understand the disappearance of Hochelaga between 1535 and 1642. The conventional explanation for the disappearance, and there are several competing ones, tends to focus on the specific cultural and political dynamics of the Iroquoian world in that period. Epidemic disease introduced by contact with Europeans, warfare among competing Iroquoian confederacies, environmental stress, the disruption of trade networks by European presence. All of these factors are real, and all of them likely contributed to whatever happened to the population of Hochelaga. But if Hochelaga was a central place, its disappearance does not necessarily mean the disappearance of the function it served. Central places do not disappear when their current occupants leave. They persist, because they are defined by something about the location itself, and other groups recognize that something and eventually return. The French who established Ville-Marie in 1642 were choosing this specific location for reasons they articulated in terms of strategic and spiritual geography. The strategic logic is obvious. The island commands the river junction. The spiritual logic is the one that gets less attention. They were founding a mission, and they chose the point at the confluence of the rivers as their specific founding site. Was that spiritual intuition entirely their own, or was it in some way shaped by the recognition of this place's significance that had been accumulating for thousands of years? The Algonquin people who were present when the French arrived certainly knew the significance of this spot. They had their own names for it and their own understanding of what it was. Did the French, even if they did not consciously understand the indigenous significance of the place, pick up on cues from the landscape and from the peoples they were encountering that guided them toward the point where everything had always been most important? This is not mysticism. This is the very ordinary process by which newcomers to a landscape learn its significant features from the people who already know it. The French arrived in a world they did not know, and they arrived in the company of indigenous guides and interpreters who did know it. The choice of the specific location at the confluence of the rivers on the southeastern tip of the island was not made in a vacuum. It was made in a context of indigenous knowledge about this landscape that, however partially and however distortedly, the French received it, shaped where they chose to build. The central place function persisted through the transition. That is what the archaeology suggests. And the buried layers beneath the current city are the physical record of that persistence. The archaeology of the Great Lakes and Street Lawrence Corridor has produced, over the past few decades, a series of discoveries that have not yet been fully synthesized, but that collectively point toward a much more complex and much more ancient story of human occupation in this region than the standard textbook account allows. The Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania has produced human occupation evidence going back to approximately 16,000 years before present, which is several thousand years earlier than the conventional Clovis first model of human entry into the Americas. The site has been extensively debated, but the evidence from Meadowcroft has never been convincingly refuted, and it has been confirmed by subsequent dating work using multiple independent methods. The Monte Verde site in Chile has produced evidence of human occupation at approximately 14,500 years before present, again predating the Clovis tradition. Monte Verde is now widely accepted by mainstream North American archaeologists as genuine evidence of pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas. The site at Calvert Island in British Columbia has produced human footprints in a beach deposit dated to approximately 13,000 years before present. Footprints that indicate the presence of 3 individuals, including at least 1 child, at a coastal location that would have been at or near the shoreline of the ice-free corridor between the coastal glaciers and the inland ice sheet, and at multiple locations in the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada, including several that are within the general region of the Montreal lowlands. There is growing evidence of human activity during or immediately following the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet, in the period between approximately 15,000 and 12,000 years before present. This evidence is fragmentary, difficult to date with precision because of the scarcity of organic material in early sites, and contested in interpretation, but its cumulative weight is significant. The story of human arrival in the Americas is almost certainly older than the Clovis model suggested, and the northeastern part of the continent, including the area that is now the Montreal lowlands, was likely occupied earlier than has been conventionally assumed. The anomalous finds from the deepest levels of the Montreal excavations, the ones that appear in sediments below the Champlain sea clay or in contexts that date before the conventional Archaic period, may be consistent with this broader pattern of earlier than expected human presence in the region. They may represent the traces of peoples who were here before the Champlain Sea filled the Street Lawrence lowlands, during the period immediately following glacial retreat, when this part of the continent was a landscape of extraordinary change and resource abundance. The Champlain Sea itself, the brief marine incursion that filled the lowlands as the land surface rebounded from glacial loading, created conditions that would have been extraordinarily rich for human populations capable of exploiting them. A shallow, productive inland sea full of marine and brackish water species, surrounded by the newly revealed land surface of the rebounding lowlands, with major rivers draining into it from the Canadian Shield, would have been an exceptional environment for the hunters and gatherers who were moving into the newly deglaciated territory. Evidence from elsewhere in the Champlain Sea Basin, particularly from sites in Vermont and upstate New York, shows that human beings were present in the area during or immediately after the marine phase. Their traces are rare and difficult to find because the landscape has been so thoroughly transformed by subsequent changes, the withdrawal of the sea, the development of the forests, the successive occupations of later cultures. But they are there. The island of Montreal, which was either partially or entirely submerged during the peak of the Champlain Sea phase, would have become accessible as the sea withdrew roughly 10,000 years ago. The southeastern tip of the island, which has the lowest elevation of any part of the island's core, would have been among the first areas to emerge as the water level dropped. And the first people to find this newly emerged island would have found a landscape of extraordinary richness, fresh water from the rivers above, access to the marine species still present in the retreating sea, and a position commanding the entire drainage system of the region. The 4,000 years of continuous occupation documented at Pointe-à-Calière, remarkable as it is, may not be the beginning of the story. It may be simply the beginning of the part of the story that we can currently read. Let me tell you about the Mohawk name for the island. The Mohawk people, who are one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and whose ancestral territory includes the Street, Lawrence Valley, call the island by a name that translates approximately as where the beaver keep the wood, or, in another rendering, where wood is taken. This name, Tiotia, K in the Mohawk language, is ancient. How ancient is not something that can be determined from linguistic analysis alone, because the name could have been given to the island at any point in the history of Mohawk or Proto-Mohawk language, and could refer to conditions that existed at various times in the island's past. But the name is interesting because it is ecological rather than political or mythological. It does not name the island after a person, a battle, a spiritual entity, or a feature of the landscape that is immediately visible. It names it after an activity, a use pattern, a relationship between the humans and the non-human inhabitants of the island, specifically beavers and wood. Beavers modify landscapes. They dam streams, create ponds, flood meadows, fall trees, and in doing so transform entire watersheds. They were among the most ecologically important species in the pre-contact landscapes of northeastern North America. They were also, famously, the primary commodity that drove the fur trade, the economic engine of the French colonial enterprise in this part of the continent. But the Mohawk name for the island is not about the fur trade. The name is older than the fur trade. It refers to a relationship with beavers and the wood they work that existed before Europeans arrived and introduced the economic incentives that transformed the beaver from an ecologically significant neighbor into a commercial commodity. The name suggests that the island was understood, at some point in the Mohawk or Proto-Mohawk relationship with this place, as being defined by the presence and activity of beavers. The rivers that run through and around the island, the Rivière Saint-Pierre, and the various streams that drained the island's interior before urbanization altered them all, would have been prime beaver habitat. The wetland areas at the base of the mountain and along the lower courses of the rivers would have been rich with the kind of riparian vegetation that beavers prefer. An island with abundant beavers is also an island with abundant wood modification. Beavers fell trees, strip bark, build dams and lodges from branches and logs. Their activity creates a particular kind of landscape ecology, open wetlands surrounded by fallen and girdled trees, with the distinctive architecture of their dams and lodges defining the character of the water bodies in the area. This is also the kind of landscape that is unusually well suited to archaeological preservation. Beaver ponds accumulate sediment rapidly. Organic material that falls or is deposited into beaver ponds is quickly buried in low oxygen, waterlogged conditions that prevent organic decay. Beaver pond sediments, when they dry out after the pond is abandoned, compact into highly preservative matrices that can maintain organic material for thousands of years. The pre-contact archaeological sites along the former courses of the island's rivers, including the Rivière Saint-Pierre, would have been surrounded by and, in some cases, directly underlain by beaver pond sediments. The extraordinary preservation of organic material that archaeologists report from well sites and waterlogged feature contexts in Old Montreal may reflect, in part, the legacy of a landscape that was extensively modified by beavers for thousands of years before any human infrastructure existed to replace their water management function. The Mohawk name remembers the beavers. The beavers may have helped preserve the record of the people who shared the island with them. And the record they preserved, in the waterlogged sediments of former beaver ponds along the routes of rivers that no longer exist, is something that the archaeology of Old Montreal has barely begun to access. The concept of deep time is one that geology introduced to modern understanding and that has never fully penetrated cultural consciousness. We know intellectually that the Earth is very old and that the landscape we inhabit has been through changes that dwarf anything in the human record. But we do not feel this the way geologists feel it. because our embodied experience of time is limited to the human scale, the span of a single life, the reach of living memory, the written record of the last several thousand years. Standing in the buried spaces beneath Old Montreal offers a limited but genuine experience of the compression of time. You are standing in a room that was at ground level in 1650. That is almost 400 years of compression into 12 feet of fill. 400 years of human activity, human decisions, human lives, compressed beneath your feet into a layer you could cross in a single step. Now, multiply that compression. The Iroquoian material beneath the French colonial layer represents another several centuries, perhaps a millennium. The woodland period material beneath that represents another 1,000 years or more. The late archaic material beneath that represents another 2,000 years. Whatever sits between the late archaic and the Champlain Sea clay represents the first few thousand years of post-glacial occupation. The entire human story on this island, 10,000 years at minimum and possibly significantly more, is compressed into a vertical column of earth and stone that is perhaps 15 to 20 meters deep at maximum. 20 meters. You could walk across that depth in a matter of seconds. Within those 20 meters is everything that human beings have thought, felt, built, discarded, buried, burned, and transformed on this specific piece of land since they first arrived. Every generation's contribution compressed into a few centimeters of sediment. Every fire site, every midden, every grave, every foundation, every discarded tool, every object of beauty or spiritual significance that was placed in the earth and left there, all of it compressed into a column that you could walk across in the time it takes to draw a breath. This is what deep time feels like when it becomes physical. This is why the buried streets are not just interesting urban history. They are one more layer in a compression of human experience that goes down much further than the 12 feet that the 19th century engineers added to the stack. And the compression is not evenly distributed. The closer you get to the surface, the more recent and therefore the more historically dense the material becomes. The French colonial period, 350 years of intense European-style urban development, occupies a relatively thin layer compared to the thousands of years of pre-contact occupation below it. But the recent layers are the ones we know best, because they are the ones the written record illuminates and the ones the most accessible archaeology has examined. The older layers, the ones that are physically thicker because the processes that compact sediment operate more slowly over longer periods, are the ones we know least well. The ratio is inverse to what intuition would suggest. The more time a layer represents, the less we know about it, because less of it has been excavated, and less of what has been excavated has been published and synthesized. This inversion is one of the fundamental challenges of urban archaeology in a place like Montreal. The city that exists above the buried layers makes it very difficult to excavate the buried layers comprehensively. The practical pressures that resist comprehensive excavation are greatest in the oldest, most architecturally and historically sensitive parts of the city, which are also the parts where the deepest and most significant archaeological layers are most likely to exist. The system produces the inversion by design. The places where archaeology would be most valuable are the places where it is most difficult and least likely to be permitted to proceed fully. I want to think for a moment about what it would mean to know the full story. Imagine that a comprehensive, systematic, fully funded, and fully executed archaeological investigation of the underground layers beneath Old Montreal were conducted. Every building in the historic district temporarily stabilized and vacated. Every street excavated to the geological baseline. Every sample collected, dated, analyzed. Every feature mapped, drawn, and interpreted. Every artifact catalogued, studied, and published. What would we find? Based on the partial evidence we have, the answer is that we would find a continuous record of human occupation on the southeastern tip of this island, going back at least 4,000 years, and possibly significantly longer. We would find evidence of multiple cultural traditions, multiple languages, multiple ways of organizing human communities, all of them choosing this same location for reasons that include, but are not limited to, its practical advantages. We would find evidence of trade networks extending thousands of kilometers in multiple directions. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from Atlantic and Gulf coasts, stone from sources in New England and the Appalachians, ceramics with stylistic connections to the Ohio Valley. We would find evidence that this was not an isolated or peripheral location but a node in a continental network of exchange, probably over the entire period of its multimillennial occupation. We would find evidence of architectural investment that goes beyond what simple subsistence organization can explain. Stone features, earth modifications, paved surfaces, constructed spaces that reflect the kind of sustained investment in place that indicates social groups with sufficient stability and cohesion to plan for the long term and to inherit and maintain structures built by previous generations. We would find evidence of ritual and ceremonial activity at scales that indicate community gathering functions, the kind of large-scale collective activity that brings together multiple communities for purposes that are social, spiritual, and probably also economic. Since exchange in pre-market economies is typically embedded in social and ceremonial contexts, rather than being a purely transactional activity. And we would find, at the bottom of the sequence, the most elusive evidence of all. The traces of the first people who recognized that this particular point on this particular island was worth coming back to, and who by coming back to it began the process that eventually produced every subsequent layer in the stack. We would not find anything that requires us to invoke extraterrestrial intervention or lost continents or secret knowledge suppressed by shadowy institutions. What we would find is more extraordinary than any of those explanations. The record of human beings choosing, recognizing, investing in, and returning to a place across such a long span of time that the duration itself becomes a kind of argument about the nature of the relationship between humans and the specific landscapes they inhabit. Some places matter more than other places. They matter not because of any mystical property that transcends physical reality, but because physical reality itself, the specific configuration of land and water and topography and ecology and climate, produces certain locations that, over time, become attractors for human attention and investment in a way that self-reinforces and compounds. The island of Montreal, and specifically its southeastern tip at the confluence of the rivers, is one of those places. The evidence is buried beneath the current city in 12 feet of 19th century fill and in the deeper layers of thousands of years of occupation. The evidence is fragmentary, inadequately studied, and unevenly preserved. But it is there, and its cumulative weight points toward a story that we have not yet told in full. There is a small detail from the Sulpician records that I keep coming back to. In one of the references I mentioned earlier, the one describing the discovery of ancient stone works in a 17th century cellar, the Sulpician administrator noted something beyond the existence and character of the stones themselves. He noted that the workers who uncovered the stones, French-Canadian workers who had grown up in the colony and who had no particular archaeological or antiquarian education, refused to remove them, not because they were structurally in the way, which they were, not because the removal would have been physically difficult, which it would have been, but because, in the words of the Sulpicians' account, the workers said the stones felt wrong to touch. That something about them made the men uncomfortable in a way that was not rational, but was not, they insisted, imagined. The Sulpician who recorded this incident was a practical, educated man. He did not make much of the workers' reluctance. He noted it as a curiosity, as an example of the superstitious tendencies of common people, and he reported that he had ordered the stones removed and that they had been removed over the workers' objections. He did not describe where the stones went. They are not among the identified archaeological collections from early colonial Montreal. They were removed and they disappeared. But what I find significant about this account is not the stones themselves. It is the workers' reaction. People who had no academic knowledge of archaeology, no theoretical framework for understanding what they might be looking at, no reason to expect that there was anything unusual about digging a cellar in the ordinary course of construction, had a visceral, physical reaction to something they found in the ground. A reaction strong enough to make them refuse an order from a man who represented both the church and the seigneurie, which in 17th century Montreal was a formidable combination of authority. What were they reacting to? I cannot answer that question with any certainty. The account is too brief and too filtered through the Sulpician's dismissive framing. But the reaction is consistent with something that appears repeatedly in accounts of unexpected archaeological discovery across many different cultures and many different historical periods. The sense that certain things in the earth are not simply old objects but are something more than that they carry a charge, a weight, a presence that exceeds their physical reality. This sense has been pathologized in the modern secular world as superstition, as the projection of human meaning onto neutral material objects. And sometimes that is precisely what it is, but sometimes, perhaps, it is something else. Sometimes it is a form of perception, a capacity for recognizing significance in material things that is older and in some ways more reliable than the rational frameworks we have built to explain and dismiss it. The workers who refused to move the stones beneath the Sulpician cellar may have known something that the Sulpician himself did not. Not in the sense of having specific historical knowledge of what the stones were or who built them, but in the sense of being able to feel the weight of what they were encountering in a way that the educated administrator, trained to analyze and categorize and dismiss, was not. The stones were removed. The cellar was finished. The building above it stood for generations, then was eventually demolished or altered beyond recognition, and the stones, whatever they were, are gone. But the worker's refusal is there, preserved in the Sulpician's dismissive account. A ghost of recognition, a memory of a moment when untrained hands touched something old and new, without being able to say how or why, that it mattered. Everything I have been describing tonight comes back, eventually, to the question of what we owe to the places we occupy. Montreal is a city of more than 2 million people. It is a city with a living culture, a functioning economy, a busy daily reality that fills the streets above the buried layers with noise and movement and the particular energy of a large, diverse, ambitious urban community. The archaeology beneath it is not, in any practical sense, competing with that daily reality. The people of Montreal are not being asked to choose between understanding their city's deep history and continuing to live their lives in it. But in a subtler sense, there is a competition. The buried layers require resources to study, and resources are finite. They require time and disruption to access, and time and disruption are costly. They require a kind of institutional attention and commitment that can only be sustained if the people and institutions of Montreal believe that understanding the deep history of this place is worth the cost. That belief has not been consistent or strong enough to produce the kind of comprehensive archaeology that the site deserves. This is not a uniquely Montreal failure. It is a broadly shared failure of urban societies to prioritize the archaeology of their own foundations, because the daily pressures of maintaining and expanding the infrastructure of urban life almost always outcompete the slower, more reflective demands of archaeological understanding. But Montreal is a particular case, and the particularity matters, because what is buried beneath Montreal is not just the history of a single colonial city in a single national narrative. What is buried there is a record of human occupation that goes back to some of the earliest periods of post-glacial humanity in this part of the world. It is a record of the continent's history as a lived human landscape, across a span of time that dwarfs the written record, across a breadth of cultural traditions that the written record has only partially captured. If we understood that record fully, it would change not just how we understand Montreal, but how we understand the pre-contact history of this continent, which is itself one of the great understudied areas of the human story. The conventional narrative of pre-contact North America, with its emphasis on small mobile hunter-gatherer bands, and its hesitancy to acknowledge the complexity and antiquity of indigenous civilization, has been slowly corroding for decades under the weight of archaeological and genetic evidence that points toward a much richer and much more ancient story. Montreal is one of the most important archaeological sites in North America for contributing to that corroded conventional narrative's eventual replacement. Its layered, continuous record of human occupation, its position at the convergence of major continental river systems, its demonstrable role as a central place across multiple cultural traditions, all of these make it an irreplaceable window into a past that most of North America has lost forever to development, natural erosion, or simple inadequate attention. We have not looked through that window carefully enough. We have allowed pieces of it to be broken and boarded over. We have filed reports in archives and stored artifacts in boxes and moved on to the next project before the significance of what we found could be fully assessed. This is a loss. Not a catastrophic, irreversible loss in the sense that all of the buried material is gone. Most of it is not gone. It is still there, below the streets, below the metro, below the Riso, in the dark, and the silence that urban archaeology has taught us to recognize as full rather than empty. But every year that passes without serious, sustained, comprehensive engagement with the archaeology of this place is a year in which more of the accessible record is damaged or destroyed by the ordinary processes of urban maintenance and development, and a year in which the stories that record contains remain inaccessible to the people who have the most reason to want to hear them. The island of Montreal has been given many names across its history. Mont Royal by Cartier, naming the island after the mountain. Hochelaga, which was the name of the city Cartier found on the island, though whether this was a name for the island itself or just the settlement is not entirely clear. Teotia, K, by the Mohawk, the name that is being increasingly used today as a recognition of the indigenous claim to the landscape. Ville-Marie by the founders of the French colony, the City of Mary, a religious designation that did not survive into common use. Montreal, the name that survived and that the city still carries, which derives from the French pronunciation of the mountain's name. Each name is a layer. Each one encodes the relationship of a specific culture to this specific place, the features they found significant, the purposes they brought to it, the language in which they expressed their experience of being here. None of the names go deep enough. None of them can go deep enough, because the names we have are from the most recent period of the place's human history, the last several hundred years in some cases, the last 1,000 or 2,000 years in others. The people who were here before that, who occupied the late Archaic and Middle Archaic and Early Archaic sites, whose traces appear at the bottom of the Pointe-à-Calière excavation and in the anomalous reports from the metro construction and in the fragments, scattered across 4,000 years of archaeological material, had their own names for this place, names we do not know, names that encoded their own understanding of why this specific island, at the convergence of these specific rivers, mattered enough to return to, generation after generation. In the cold winters and the hot summers and the spring floods and the autumn abundance, those names are gone. They are not in any archive. They are not in any oral tradition that has survived to the present in recoverable form. They are gone with the people who spoke them, lost in the gap between the archaeological record and the living present that all pre-literate cultures eventually fall into. What we have instead of those names is the record itself. The stones fitted together in the dark below the city, the copper placed in the bottom of a well, the hearth burning at the center of a paved floor in a building that was absorbed and built over and eventually forgotten, the sound of water running below a basement floor in a building on one of the oldest streets in the district. The earthwork alignments on the mountain's north slope, documented before they were destroyed by the park development, pointing in directions that no casual observer would have noticed, but that someone, in some period of this island's long occupation, found significant enough to mark in the earth. These things are names. They are the names of a relationship with a place, a relationship so long and so persistent that it defies the ordinary categories we use to think about human history and the landscapes humans have occupied. The buried streets of Old Montreal are the most recent chapter in that relationship. They are the most legible chapter, the most accessible, the one whose physical reality you can walk into if you go to the right basement in the right building and know where to look. But they are not the first chapter, and they are not the most significant one. The most significant chapter is the one we have not yet read, that sits in the darkness below the raised streets and the filled rivers and the sealed wells, waiting. 12 feet of fill raised the streets. 200 years of forgetfulness sealed the basements. 5 decades of underground city construction built another layer of concrete and granite and tile above everything that came before. And below all of it, the island's memory persists, patient in the way that stone is patient, full in the way that old silence is full, waiting in the way that everything buried is waiting, for the day when someone comes down with the right tools and the right questions and enough time to finally hear what this place has been trying to say. The last thing I want to tell you is something personal. I have spent a long time with this story. Going through the archaeological grey literature, the Sulpician archives, the published reports and the unpublished ones, the accounts of workers and archaeologists and contractors and historians who have spent their professional lives in and around the buried layers of this city. I have walked through Old Montreal at different times of day and in different seasons, trying to feel the relationship between the contemporary surface and what exists below it. I have stood in the lower levels of buildings where the original floor is visible, looking at stone walls built 350 years ago, feeling the weight of the city above. And what I keep coming back to is not the mystery, as compelling as the mystery is. What I keep coming back to is the continuity. This place has been here for a very long time. The island was here before humans arrived on it. The rivers were here before the island was fully formed as a landmass. The mountain was here before the rivers found their current courses. And the humans who eventually found this place and recognized it and came back to it and built on it and buried things in it and under it and raised its streets and tunneled below it and built their underground city through it. All of them are part of a single, continuous, unbroken relationship between this place and the human beings who have lived in and with it. The French colonial Montrealers who raised the streets in the 19th century were not destroying the history below them, not intentionally. They were doing what every generation before them had done, They were building their present on the foundation of the past, which is the only way that cities and civilizations and human cultures of any kind have ever worked. The tragedy is not that they built over what came before. The tragedy is that in building over it, they did not understand what they were building over, and in not understanding it, they made it harder for us to understand it too. But harder is not the same as impossible. The buried layers are still there. The silence below the streets still has content. The things placed in the earth by people who understood this place in ways we are only beginning to learn to ask about are still waiting. We could go down and look, if we chose to. If we decided that the story beneath the streets of Old Montreal is worth the time and the cost and the disruption that understanding it would require, I think it is. I think the depth of the story, the thousands of years of human engagement with this specific place, the evidence of connection and investment and recognition that goes back further than any written record and further than most archaeological work has yet reached. I think that story is one of the most important stories we could tell about this continent and about human beings, and about the long relationship between a species and the landscapes it inhabits. The streets were raised by 12 feet. Below those 12 feet is the colonial city, frozen in its own basement. Below the colonial city is everything that came before. And below everything that came before is something older still, and stranger, and more patient than anything we have yet found the courage to fully look at. The city above it keeps moving, keeps building, keeps layering its present over the past that made it. But the past is still there. Everything buried is still there, and it has been waiting a very long time for someone to come down and simply look. Thank you for spending this time with this story tonight. If you are falling asleep, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. If you are still awake, I am glad you stayed. This kind of history, the kind that goes down instead of up, the kind that asks what is underneath rather than what was built on top, is the history I am most drawn to because it is the history that most challenges what we think we know. If you want to find more of it, there are resources in the description below. The published archaeology from Pointe-à-Callière is genuinely excellent and worth reading. The grey literature of the Montreal Metro project is harder to access, but portions of it are available through the Quebec Archaeological Registry. The Sulpician archive is real and genuinely contains the references I described, though accessing it requires going through the Grand Seminaire itself. And if you ever find yourself in Old Montreal, go into the Pointe-à-Callière Museum. Take the descent seriously. Feel the weight of the city above you. Look at the stones of the original French colonial foundations. And then, when you have done all that, ask yourself what might be below the floor you are standing on. Because there is always something below the floor you are standing on. That is what this island has been trying to tell us for a very long time. Subscribe if you want to hear more. Leave a comment letting me know where you are in the world tonight. I always read them, and rest well. The city above the buried streets is busy and loud and full of life, but below it, the island remembers. And remembering is the oldest thing that humans and places do together. End of script. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in buildings. Not the knowledge in the books that fill their shelves, or the documents in their archives, or the memories in the minds of the people who work in them. A different kind of knowledge, specific to the building itself, to its stones and its beams and its dimensions and its proportions, to the way the light moves through it at different times of day and different seasons of the year, to the sounds it makes, as it expands and contracts in the heat and cold. This is the knowledge that a building accumulates by existing in a place over time, by being the specific shaped space that it is in the specific location that it occupies. Old buildings know things that new buildings do not. This is not mysticism. It is a statement about information density. Every year a building stands, it accumulates more material evidence of its own history. The wear patterns on its floors, the soot deposits in its chimneys, the repairs and modifications visible in its walls, the layered paint and plaster that records every time someone decided this surface needed to be changed. An old building is a three-dimensional archive of its own experience. The oldest buildings in Old Montreal are extraordinary archives of this kind. They have been standing for 300 years or more. They have been through fires and floods and renovations and changes of use and ownership and political regime. They have been adapted and modified and in some cases nearly destroyed and rebuilt. But they are still there, and in their structure, the information of 3 centuries of inhabitation is encoded in ways that patient and skilled reading can recover. And beneath those buildings, in the sealed basements and the buried ground floors, and the lower vault spaces that the contractors encounter in renovation and the archaeologists reach in excavations, is another archive. the archive of what was here before the buildings. The archive of the ground itself, accumulated across a span of time that the oldest standing building cannot approach. These two archives overlap and interact. The building's foundations reach into the ground, and the ground preserves the signatures of the building's construction and use alongside the signatures of everything that came before. A careful archaeologist excavating beneath an old building is reading both archives simultaneously, untangling the threads of the building's history from the threads of the longer history below it. This is delicate work. It requires patience and precision and the ability to hold multiple timelines in mind simultaneously. It requires the intellectual flexibility to move between the specific evidence of a particular artifact or feature and the broader interpretive framework that gives that evidence meaning. It requires, in short, exactly the kind of sustained, careful attention that the pressures of urban development rarely permit. The buildings of Old Montreal deserve that attention. The ground beneath them deserves it even more. And the full picture, the three-dimensional archive of human experience in this specific place across the full span of its occupation, is something that the city of Montreal has the archaeological resources to begin assembling if it chooses to make the commitment. That commitment would start with a comprehensive survey, not an excavation, which is disruptive and expensive and irreversible, but a systematic assessment of the archaeological potential of the entire district using non-invasive remote sensing technologies that have advanced enormously in the past 2 decades. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, electrical resistivity tomography, LiDAR mapping of subtle topographic features. These technologies can see below the surface without disturbing it, can map buried features with a precision and coverage that was not possible even 20 years ago. A comprehensive, non-invasive survey of the buried landscape beneath Old Montreal would cost a fraction of what a comprehensive excavation would cost. It would produce a map of buried features across the entire district. It would identify the locations where excavation, when circumstances permit, would be most productive. It would provide a baseline against which future development impacts could be assessed. And it would begin to answer the fundamental question that all of the partial evidence I've been describing leaves open. What exactly is down there? The technology exists. The expertise exists. The institutional framework for commissioning and conducting such a survey exists. What has been lacking is the decision to make it a priority, to treat the buried landscape of Old Montreal as the extraordinary archaeological resource that it is, and to invest in understanding it at the level that its importance deserves. This is a decision that could be made. It is not a particularly expensive decision, relative to the budgets of the institutions involved. It is a decision that would produce real knowledge, recoverable knowledge, the kind of knowledge that changes how a city understands itself and its place in the longer story of human presence on this continent. It is a decision that has not yet been made, but every year, more people come to understand what is down there. More people ask the questions that the standard accounts cannot adequately answer. More people notice the gap between what the archaeology has found and what the public narrative acknowledges. And more people, perhaps, are willing to insist that filling that gap is worth the investment. The buried streets of Old Montreal, raised by 12 feet in the 19th century, are a remarkable story. The full story, the one that goes down through all the layers beneath those buried streets, is a far more remarkable one, and it is waiting to be told. There is one more thing I want to say about the Hochelaga that Cartier found and the mystery of its disappearance. For decades, historians and archaeologists have debated whether Hochelaga was actually on the island of Montreal, or whether Cartier's account places it elsewhere, perhaps on the south shore of the Centaur, Lawrence, or further up the river. This debate has been conducted largely among specialists and has not significantly penetrated public understanding, but it matters, because the location of Hochelaga has direct implications for how we understand the archaeology of the island. The majority view, which has strengthened in recent decades with additional archaeological evidence, places Hochelaga on the island of Montreal, in approximately the location where McGill University now stands, in the area called Dawson College in Cartier's account, though that name is a corruption of a later English designation rather than an Iroquoian place name. This location, at the base of the southern slope of Mont Royal, would have given the settlement access to the mountain above it, clear lines of communication with the river below it, and proximity to the water sources provided by the springs on the mountain's flanks. The disappearance of Hochelaga from this location between 1535 and 1642 is one of the great unsolved puzzles of North American pre-contact history. The most commonly cited explanation is epidemic disease. European explorers in the first contact period unknowingly introduced diseases to which indigenous populations had no immunity, and those diseases moved through indigenous trade networks faster than the Europeans themselves did, devastating populations before Europeans ever arrived to observe the devastation. This explanation is well supported by evidence from elsewhere in North America, particularly in coastal regions where contact was earlier and more intensive, and where European accounts do record the observation of populations devastated by disease. But for Hochelaga specifically, the evidence is less direct, because the disappearance happened in a gap in the written record after Cartier's visit and before the next recorded European presence at that location. What is less often discussed is the political dimension of the disappearance. The period between 1535 and 1642 was one of intense conflict and restructuring among the Iroquoian-speaking peoples of the Centrete, Lawrence Valley and Great Lakes region. The Five Nations Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which had been forming in the decades before European contact, was expanding its territorial reach and establishing control over trade routes that ran through the Strait Lawrence Corridor. The St. Lawrence Iroquoians, of whom the people of Hochelaga and the related settlement of Stadacona near Quebec City were the most important, were caught between the expanding Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the south and the Algonquin-speaking peoples to the north, who were themselves being disrupted by both indigenous political change and European contact. In this political environment, the disappearance of Hochelaga may represent not simply population collapse from disease, but the violent or politically coerced displacement of its people, their absorption into other communities, their flight to locations that offered better protection, or some combination of all of these. The Strait Lawrence Iroquoians, as a distinct cultural group, disappeared entirely from the written record in the early 17th century, not just from Montreal but from the entire St. Lawrence Valley. This total disappearance is consistent with either catastrophic disease, mortality, or with political and military defeat that scattered the survivors and dissolved the cultural identity they had maintained. Either way, what was lost with Hochelaga was not just a population of several thousand people. It was the living continuity of an understanding of this place, the knowledge of what it was, what it had been, what it meant, that the people of Hochelaga had maintained across generations. The Algonquin-speaking peoples who were present when the French arrived in 1642 knew this island and had their own relationship with it, but they did not know it in the way that Hochelaga's inhabitants had known it, with the specific cultural memory of generations of occupation in the most intensive sense. The French who arrived found a landscape whose full significance they could not read, because the people who could have read it for them were gone. The Algonquin guides and informants who helped the French understand the landscape they were entering knew what they knew and shared what they chose to share. But the deepest knowledge of this place, the knowledge that had accumulated across the centuries of Iroquoian occupation and the millennia of pre-Iroquoian occupation before that, had been disrupted by whatever happened to the people of Hochelaga. This disruption is perhaps the deepest loss in the entire story of Montreal's buried past. Not the sealed basements or the destroyed earthworks or the anomalous finds in the Metro reports, as significant as all of those are. The deepest loss is the living knowledge that no longer exists to inform our reading of the material record. The elders who could have told us what the stone features were for, why the wells went deeper than they needed to, what the mountain meant, what the name for this place was in the generations before the name we know, those elders are long gone, and the knowledge they carried is lost in a way that archaeology, however sophisticated, cannot fully recover. What archaeology can do, and what it has barely begun to do in this case, is to assemble the material evidence in a form comprehensive enough to support more informed interpretation that can be enriched by the oral histories and cultural knowledge that the indigenous communities, who are the inheritors of this landscape's pre-contact history, still maintain, even in the fragmented and disrupted form that colonization has left them. The collaboration between archaeological science and indigenous knowledge that the best contemporary heritage practice calls for is not happening in Montreal at the scale the situation demands. It is happening in fragments, in specific projects with specific community partners, but not as a systematic commitment of the institutions responsible for the city's heritage to understand this place in its full depth, in partnership with the communities who have the longest relationship with it. That partnership, if it were established at the necessary scale, would be transformative, not just for the archaeology, which would benefit from indigenous knowledge that can guide interpretation in ways that purely material analysis cannot, but for the indigenous communities themselves, whose relationship to this landscape has been severed and disrupted in so many ways that even partial reconnection, through the collaborative reconstruction of the place's pre-contact history, could be significant. The buried streets are a story about what happens when a living city grows over its own past. The indigenous history beneath them is a story about what happens when a living culture is severed from its relationship to its landscape. Both stories are incomplete, and both call for the same thing: the sustained, committed effort to go beneath the surface of what we already know and find what is waiting below. The archaeologist who wrote the report about the anomalous stone features in the Metro excavation from 1978, the report I described earlier with the radiocarbon dates that came back older than expected, is now retired. I was able to speak to her briefly, through an intermediary, about that report and about her career in Montreal archaeology more broadly. She did not want to be directly quoted, and I will honour that. But she agreed to speak to me in general terms about the experience of doing archaeology in the context of major infrastructure projects in Montreal, and what she said illuminates something important about why the story beneath the streets has remained incomplete for so long. She described the fundamental tension of the work as being between the pace of the infrastructure project and the pace of archaeology. Infrastructure projects operate on schedules that are planned in advance, contracted to specific milestones, and enforced by financial penalties for delay. A metro tunnel section has to be completed by a certain date. A utility replacement project has to reconnect services within a certain window. These are not arbitrary constraints. They reflect real practical and financial realities. Archaeology cannot operate on those schedules. Careful archaeological work requires time for observation, for documentation, for sampling, for the kind of careful stratigraphic analysis that is the discipline's most fundamental practice. It requires the flexibility to stop when something unexpected appears and spend the time necessary to understand what that thing is before moving on. The two requirements are essentially incompatible in the context of a major urban infrastructure project. The infrastructure will not wait for the archaeology to be done properly, and the archaeology, conducted under the time pressures of the infrastructure project, cannot be done properly. The result is the pattern I have been describing throughout this exploration. 2. Finds that are documented at the minimum required level and then built over. Reports that are filed without the follow-up analysis they call for. Anomalies that are noted and then explained away because fully investigating them would require a delay that the project cannot absorb. She told me that over the course of her career, she estimated she had seen several dozen finds in Montreal that deserved comprehensive investigation and received inadequate investigation, not because anyone involved was malicious or negligent, because the system in which they were all working did not allocate the time or resources to do it properly. She said something at the end of our conversation that I want to share because I think it captures the essential character of the situation. She said, "There is more interesting archaeology beneath Montreal than most archaeologists in this country will do in their entire careers. And most of it is going to be built over before anyone gets to look at it properly." She said it without bitterness, as a statement of fact. The kind of fact that people who have worked within a system long enough learn to accept without the emotional response that outsiders might expect. I found it devastating. The buried streets of Old Montreal were raised by 12 feet. Below them is a colonial city frozen in its own basement. Below that is a sequence of human occupation going back thousands of years, with characteristics and anomalies and significance that the current state of the archaeology cannot fully account for. And the pace at which the city above is being renewed and maintained is outrunning the pace at which the city below is being understood. This is the situation. This is what has not been shown. Not because it is being hidden, because it is being built over, again, in the ordinary course of a city doing what cities do, maintaining its infrastructure, expanding its services, meeting the needs of the people who live in it, building its present on the foundation of its past, as every generation before it has done, and as every generation after it will do. But the past does not disappear just because the present builds over it. It waits. It is patient in the way that buried things are patient. It is full of what was put into it by the people who understood it before us. And someday, perhaps, the combination of technology and will and resources and curiosity that the situation requires will come together long enough to begin the work of recovering what has been waiting. Until then, the streets of Old Montreal are 12 feet above where they used to be, and everything below those 12 feet, everything below the raised streets and the sealed basements and the buried rivers and the ancient wells and the stone features with their anomalous dates and the copper objects in their unlabeled storage boxes, everything below is still there, unchanged, undisturbed, waiting. As it has been waiting for a very long time. Final thoughts. The island in the river, the mountain at its centre, the rivers at its tip, the 12 feet of fill, the colonial basements, the Iroquoian occupation, the woodland period sites, the late archaic camps, the anomalous stone features, the copper objects, the Sulpician records of unexplained ancient stonework, the radiocarbon dates that do not fit the standard account, the earthworks on the mountain's north slope, documented and then destroyed, the buried river and its rich archaeological sequence, the wells that go deeper than they need to, the sound of running water below the basement floor, the workers' photographs of a stone surface at the bottom of a utility trench, the archaeologist's quiet statement that most of the interesting archaeology beneath this city will be built over before anyone gets to look at it properly. All of these things are real. All of them are part of a single story. The story of a place that has been recognized as significant by human beings across a span of time that most of us find very difficult to hold in our minds. A place that has accumulated layer after layer of human investment, human presence, human meaning, until the accumulated weight of all those layers is more than any individual excavation or any individual report or any individual account can adequately represent. The buried streets of Old Montreal are the entry point to that story. They are the most recent and most accessible layer. They are the layer you can literally walk into, in the right basement of the right building, and feel the truth of the claim that there is a city beneath the city, but they are not the full story. The full story goes much deeper, and the full story has never been properly told, never been fully investigated, never been assembled from the fragments that exist in archives and storage rooms and grey literature reports, and the memories of retired archaeologists, and the phone photographs of utility workers, and the occasional careful statement of a published museum exhibit. The full story is down there, below the 12 feet, below the raised streets and the colonial city and the Iroquoian occupation and the woodland period sites and the late archaic camps and the anomalous features and the marine clay of the Champlain Sea. It is there. It is patient. It is waiting. And someday, if we ask the right questions and make the right commitments and do the work that the place deserves, we are going to find it. What is beneath the streets of Old Montreal has never been shown, but it can be, and it should be. End. There is a walk you can take in Old Montreal that most tourists do not take, and that most residents have never taken, and that the city's own heritage information materials do not describe. It starts at the corner of the oldest surviving commercial street in the district, which runs roughly parallel to the waterfront, a block or two inland from the St. Lawrence. You walk slowly. That is the first requirement. You cannot do this walk at the pace of ordinary urban movement, because the ordinary pace of urban movement is designed to carry you from point A to point B efficiently, and that efficiency is the enemy of what this walk is for. Walk slowly. Look at the buildings. Not at their facades, though the facades are beautiful and full of history. Look at the ground floor level relative to the street. Notice how some buildings have their original stone thresholds at the current sidewalk level, and how others, the older ones, have thresholds that sit a step or two below the sidewalk. The ones that sit below are the ones whose original ground level was sealed under the street raising. They have been given new entrances at the current level, but their original relationship to the ground persists in the stone, in the slight awkwardness of a threshold that does not quite meet the sidewalk at the expected angle. These details are everywhere once you start looking for them. They are the fingerprints of the raising, the places where the 19th century engineering project could not completely erase the memory of the street level it replaced. They are visible. They have always been visible, but they require the slow walk and the patient attention to become legible as what they are, evidence. Then find a building with access to its lowest level. Not a tourist attraction, not a museum, just an old building whose owner or manager is willing to let a curious person descend. The concierge of a hotel in the old stones, the owner of a restaurant whose dining room is in a 17th century vault, the manager of an office building whose parking level extends below the foundations of the old city. Go down, feel the temperature drop, notice the way the sound changes, stand at the lowest point you can reach, and look at the walls. Are the stones mortared or dry-fitted? What is the character of the facing? Is the floor original stone or poured concrete? Is there any evidence, in the moisture patterns or the mineral deposits on the walls, of water movement that is not from current plumbing? Then stand still and be quiet for longer than feels comfortable. Let the silence of the place settle around you. Let the weight of what is above you, the streets and the cars and the restaurants and the people, and the metro and the RISO, and the entire living apparatus of the contemporary city, let that weight register as the physical reality it is. And then let yourself wonder what is below the floor you are standing on. Because there is always something below the floor you are standing on. The island knows. The stones know. The compressed, patient darkness below the raised streets knows everything that was ever put into it by the human beings who preceded you on this island by centuries and millennia. The buried streets of Old Montreal are 12 feet below where they used to be. And what is below those buried streets has never been shown. Not completely. Not honestly. Not in a way that does justice to the depth and the complexity and the extraordinary duration of the human story that the archaeology of this place, partial and fragmentary and inadequately resourced as it is, has managed to preserve. That story deserves to be told in full. It deserves the investment and the commitment and the sustained curiosity that it has not yet received. The streets were raised. The past was buried. And the buried past is more interesting, more complex, more ancient, and more significant than the raised streets that cover it. This is what it means to live in a city with a deep past. This is what it means to occupy a landscape that human beings have been recognizing and investing in and building on and burying their dead in and returning to for thousands of years. The layers accumulate. The present keeps building over the past. The past keeps waiting, in the dark below, for someone to come down and finally give it the attention it deserves. Montreal is that city. The island of Montreal is that landscape. And what is beneath the raised streets of its oldest district is a story that this continent owes itself the honesty to tell. Go slow. Look at the thresholds. Descend when you can. Stand in the silence. And listen. End of script. There is a specific research project that was proposed and funded and then quietly discontinued in the early 2000s that deserves mention here, because its history illuminates something important about the institutional dynamics that shape what gets studied and what does not. In 2002, a team of researchers from 2 Montreal universities submitted a proposal to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for funding to conduct a comprehensive systematic review of all archaeological data collected from the island of Montreal since the beginning of the Metro project in 1966. The proposal was not for new excavation. It was for synthesis, the assembly of existing reports, the coordination of existing collections, the application of current analytical methods to previously collected samples, and the integration of indigenous oral history and traditional knowledge into the interpretive framework for the assembled data. This kind of synthesis project is considered standard practice in the archaeology of well-studied regions. The American Southwest, the British Isles, the river valleys of continental Europe have all benefited enormously from comprehensive synthesis projects that pulled together decades of piecemeal excavation results and produced interpretive frameworks that the individual projects could not have generated on their own. The value of such projects is well established. The Montreal synthesis proposal was competitive. It was reviewed by experts who found it well conceived and scientifically sound. It was funded at a reduced level from the original request for an initial 3-year phase. At the end of the 3-year phase, a preliminary report had been produced that outlined the scope of the existing data, identified the most significant gaps and anomalies, and established a framework for the interpretive work that would follow in subsequent phases. The preliminary report confirmed what individual researchers had been saying for years. The existing data from the Montreal Urban Archaeological Record was far richer and far more anomalous than any published synthesis had acknowledged, and a comprehensive interpretive project would almost certainly produce findings of major significance for the understanding of pre-contact North American history. The funding for subsequent phases was not renewed. The reasons given were budgetary. The Research Council's priorities had shifted. The funding envelope for this type of project had been reduced. The proposal for continuation did not score sufficiently highly in the competitive review process. The preliminary report is a public document. It can be found, with some effort, in the Research Council's online archive. It is careful and professional in its language and does not make dramatic claims. But reading between its careful lines, the significance of what it describes is unmistakable. The researchers who produced it are still working. Some of them are still in Montreal. They have published individual papers on aspects of the material they reviewed. But the comprehensive synthesis, the work that would have assembled the full picture and placed the anomalies in the context that would make their significance legible, was never completed. The proposal was put in for renewal funding multiple times. It was unsuccessful each time. The team eventually dispersed, as academic teams do when the funding that holds them together disappears. The data they reviewed still exists. The anomalies they identified are still there in the reports and the collections. The framework they began building is still in the preliminary report, but the synthesis was never finished. And so the full picture remains unassembled, not because the pieces do not exist. They do, but because the resources and institutional commitment necessary to put the pieces together in a way that would reveal the full image have not been sustained. This is the archaeology of Old Montreal in institutional form. The pieces exist, the synthesis does not. The meaning that the assembled pieces would reveal remains latent in the individual components, waiting for the moment when someone commits the resources necessary to assemble them. That moment has not come, but the data has not degraded. The reports are in the archives. The samples are in storage. The preliminary synthesis framework exists in a document on a research council server. The moment could still come. And when it does, what it reveals about the buried history of this city and about the broader story of human presence on this continent will be worth every year of waiting. End of script. One final thought about the nature of what is buried beneath this city, and why it matters that we have not yet found the will to look at it fully. Every major city in the world sits on layers of its own past. Rome famously sits on Rome. London sits on Roman Londinium and on the even older settlement that preceded it. Cairo sits on multiple pharaonic cities and on the medieval Islamic city and on the Ottoman city and on the colonial city. Istanbul sits on Constantinople, which sits on Byzantium, which sits on Chalcedon and beyond. The layering of cities on their own pasts is one of the defining characteristics of the great urban centers of human civilization, and it is part of what gives those cities their particular quality of compressed time, their sense of being places where the past is never fully gone, where the stones of old buildings appear in the foundations of new ones, where the street grids of ancient cities persist in the patterns of contemporary traffic. Montreal is younger, as cities go. 380 years of documented European-style urban development does not compare to Rome's 2,500 years of continuous occupation. But the pre-contact occupation that underlies the colonial city, stretching back 4,000 years at minimum at the core of the site and potentially much longer across the island as a whole, gives Montreal a depth that its documented history does not immediately convey. And that depth is of a particular character. It is not the depth of continuous recorded history, with the unbroken succession of dates and names and events that makes the layering of Rome or Istanbul so legible. It is the depth of human presence without written record, of cultures that left their traces in the earth but not in text, of a relationship between people and place that was expressed in building and burial and trade and ceremony, rather than in the production of documents that would survive to tell later generations what it meant. This kind of depth is harder to read than the documented kind. It requires different tools, different methods, different interpretive frameworks. It requires archaeology rather than historiography, and it requires the kind of archaeology that goes slowly and carefully enough to preserve what it finds, rather than the kind that documents and moves on. Montreal has not yet fully applied those tools to its own buried past. The resources and the will and the collaborative relationships with Indigenous communities that such an application would require have not yet been assembled at the necessary scale. But the past does not grow less interesting with waiting. If anything, as the analytical tools improve and as the interpretive frameworks that the best contemporary archaeology has developed become more sophisticated, the potential yield of a serious systematic investigation of the buried layers beneath Old Montreal grows greater, not smaller. The 12 feet of fill that raised the streets in the 19th century preserved what it covered. The colonial city below those 12 feet has been waiting, in better condition than anyone who participated in the raising could have imagined, for the 2 centuries since the work was done. The pre-colonial layers below the colonial city have been waiting even longer, and the anomalous features at the bottom of the sequence, the ones that do not fit the standard story, have been waiting in silence and darkness for as long as any of it. What is beneath the streets of Old Montreal has never been shown. Not because it cannot be shown, because we have not yet chosen to show it. That choice is still available. The past is patient. It will wait. The question is whether we will choose to look before the next phase of urban development buries the accessible record under another layer of concrete and infrastructure, sealing it away for another generation or another century. The streets were raised. The city built over its own past, and the past Below the raised streets and the buried basements and the sealed wells and the buried rivers and the compacted centuries of human presence is waiting, as it has always waited, as it will continue to wait, until we are finally ready to go down and look.